Hey, Steve, we'll start out with the Pledge of Allegiance. Just in time. I pledge allegiance
To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
So we're going to change up a couple things tonight in the interest of our guest here. We're going to move 6A and 6B up front and begin with that, and then we'll move to the work session afterwards in the interest of their time. So we will move to public hearing, consent agenda. Have we had,
Sorry.
has commissioners had an opportunity to look over the notes from last time? And if so, do we have a motion?
I'll have a motion that we accept the minutes. I'll second it.
Okay. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, say same. Okay. Moving on to consider a request for a special use permit to operate a tattoo salon in a B2 general business district on lots 11-J-1 and 11-J-15 of the North Loop Business Park subdivision, located at 5016 Justin Street. This request has been made by Krista Robertson, case number SUP 2022-04.
All right, thank you, Chair. Elena Helton, City Planner. So as stated, this request is for a specific use permit for a tattoo salon. The tattoo salon is to be located in an existing commercial building known as the FX Hair Salon. It's been there for several years, located along Justin Street. They recently did an expansion, and the applicant would like to occupy a 200 square foot space for by appointment tattoo services. Again, the size of the space will be 200 square feet. The operating hours are shown on your screen, and they include Tuesday through Friday from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m., Saturday through 10 a.m. to 2 p.m., and Sunday and Monday, the applicant has stated that they'll be closed. So again, this is a commercial B2 property. The zoning ordinance states that property that is zoned B2 general business can operate a tattoo salon with approval of a specific use permit. So the specific use permit allows staff, the commission, and city council to review these types of requests and then impose any conditions if necessary on such businesses. And when you look at the adjacent property to the east is zoned light industrial. It's a large department store. To the north, you have some offices. And then to the northwest, you have some single-family residences. We did meet with those residences and just had an informal meeting here at City Hall to talk about the business model and what was being proposed. And generally, the residents were in support of the request with the conditions that are outlined. So specifically the hours of operation and the size of the business. And a few of them are here this evening, so they may speak during the public hearing portion. This is a photo of the actual storefront. So in yellow, we've highlighted the area where the tattoo parlor will be located. It'll have a separate entrance on the exterior, but it'll also be connected to the interior of the other business, the hair salon. And so that's just another image again of the interior of the space. These are some site photos. So again, this is the view of the property from Justin Street. And you can see there's a special effects sign, and there's no additional signage proposed with this development. These are some images on the upper left. You have some images of the commercial office buildings to the north, and then those are some images of the entrance into that single-family neighborhood that we just talked about. Again, this is those large department stores. They're located to the east. You see Ashley Home Furniture, and then in the distance you can see Lowe's. And then on the lower right, you can see a commercial restaurant that's located next to the property or in close proximity to the subject property. These are just some street views when you're standing at the entrance of Justin Street and kind of looking to the east and the west along North Stallings Drive, so just to give you an idea of the surrounding character of the area. And this is an image of the entrance into the Wood Creek subdivision, which is located south across North Stallings Drive. So as part of the request, we did send notices to property owners within 200 feet. We did receive one letter in support of the request. We also sent courtesy postcards to property owners within 500 feet, We also place a sign on the property, and we advertise these cases on our website and social media. The conditions for approval of specific use permit are the same ones that this commission reviews whenever we're reviewing zone change requests. And they include compatibility, orderly growth and development, facilities, drives, and parking, the abatement of any nuisances, addressing lighting, landscaping, and compliance with the comprehensive plan. The comprehensive plan does call out business for this area, and the specific use permit won't actually affect any of the approved land uses that are already allowed in that underlying commercial district. So staff finds that the request does meet the review criteria, and we are recommending approval. And this item is scheduled for City Council on October 11th, and the applicant is also in attendance if the commission should have any questions. So with that, I'll conclude our presentation and open it up for questions from the commission.
Any questions?
All right, want to open it up for public hearing?
Does the applicant, would the applicant like to speak? No, you don't have to. You don't have to at all. You good?
Yes.
Okay.
Would the salon owner like to speak?
Just remind everyone, when you come up, we appreciate you being here, but if you would state your full name and address and try to limit your time to 3 minutes, please.
Okay, I'm Autumn Anthony. I own the salon at 5016 Justin Street. I've been there since 2004. Have my neighbors behind me in support of us, which is great. You know, I would never do anything to jeopardize my business, as I do run a very good, successful business. I've been in business since 1999. So with that being said, I would like you to approve it.
So Autumn, tell us a little bit more about what's going on with your salon. You've expanded recently.
Yes.
Okay.
We have doubled in size, added more stylists, added more services as far as like lashes. So yeah, we're just growing, still growing after 23 years of business. So I'm blessed.
Good. Congratulations.
Yeah, congratulations to your success.
Thank you. And that will be all.
All righty. Thank you.
Thank you.
Would anyone else like to come up and speak? You don't have to. Hey, Matt. I'm sorry?
I said I had asked her my question.
Okay. Okay.
Hey, Matt.
You just say the pledge, please.
If there are no other comments, we'll close that to the public hearing. And
All right, hi, Commissioner Perry, how are you?
Hi there. My apologies for being late. The doctor took a little longer than I expected.
it's okay.
No, you're fine. I will ask that since you missed the initial presentation, so we moved things around a little bit and went ahead and did the regular agenda. When we get ready to vote, I'm just going to ask for the 4 who were present during the presentation to vote, if that's all right.
Sure.
All right, thank you.
Okay. So we closed it. Do we have a motion on this?
I'll make a motion to approve the special use permit for the tattoo parlor inside Revere.
I'll second.
Okay. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All those opposed say same. Okay. Motion carries.
Congratulations.
Thank you. You guys can, you can leave if you want to. You don't have to stick around, so.
Unless you guys want to learn about floodplains and all sorts of things.
Yeah, all the fun stuff.
Yeah, you should stay.
Okay. We'll move into, moving on into the work session. And Elena, do I need to read that out?
Yeah, just, if you will, just read agenda item 3A.
Yep. Presentation, discussion regarding an overview of various elements of the Texas Open Meetings Act and cities' police powers related to the regulation of land use and development as outlined in the Texas Local Government Code.
All right, so I'm going to kick off this portion of the presentation by talking about the Texas Open Meetings Act. You guys watched that video and got your certificate prior to sitting in on your first Planning and Zoning Commission meeting. For the 3 of you who were appointed last year, we actually had a special work session and kind of went over this material in detail, and then I met with Commissioner Forbes and Commissioner Perry individually and went over it. But this material is, some of it can be very nuanced, and so I know sometimes there's questions about what is actually a violation of the Texas Open Meetings Act. And with new commission, I thought it'd be, one, a good refresher for you that have been on for a while, and then two, a deeper dive for our new commissioners. And then I'm going to let City Attorney Steve Kirkland get up, and we're going to talk more about that. He'll answer questions you have, and then we'll get into Texas Local Government Code in relation to the authority that it gives cities for regulating land use, subdivisions, and adopting comprehensive plans. And basically, we're going to look at our police powers as far as what we can regulate and what we can't. There were I think there were a couple items that were brought up during our last Planning and Zoning Commission meeting. And so I want to make sure that the commission is educated on kind of the limits of different conditions or standards that we place on developments. There's some legal things that we need to be aware of whenever we're making recommendations, so we stay out of trouble. And that's what Kirkland is here for. So we'll do that. And then the second item is going to be me and Steve Bartlett, and we're going to talk about the floodplain ordinance, how we regulate floodplain, and then we'll actually talk about the comprehensive plan, specifically Chapter 4, environmental, and how that relates to our development code. So a lot of information. We printed out some additional resources for you guys and put them at your place. So you actually have a copy of Chapter 4 from the comprehensive plan, which is environment and natural resources, and we gave you a copy of our floodplain ordinance too. And when we get to that item, Margaret's going to pass out some more stuff. So just wanted to give you kind of an overview. We're not going to talk about specific zoning cases that are pending for an agenda. So we're just going to keep it very general and not discuss specific details of projects that may or may not be coming forward to the Planning and Zoning Commission. So before we get started, any questions about any of that? All right, perfect. So first, we'll provide some background information about what the Open Meetings Act is, who is subject to the act, and get familiar with some of the terms. And then we'll talk about notice requirements and record keeping, and then some procedural requirements specifically for executive sessions, and then penalties for violating the Open Meetings Act. And if you guys have any questions along the way, please stop and interrupt me. This is meant to be very informal and more of a discussion. So general background. So there's a reason why we have these laws. Usually it's because there's a few bad actors that don't play by the rules, and so someone has to pass a law in order to make people follow proper procedures. And so this just provides some different case law on how this law came into adoption. It talks about a specific case where Sharpston stock fraud scandals of the 1970s. There was a lot of kind of closed-door meetings, which prompted more rules for having open, transparent public meetings. And essentially, this was passed. This prompted the Texas legislature to pass the Open Meetings Act. The act was passed on the premise that citizens are entitled not only to know what governments decide, but to observe how and why every decision is reached. And then Senator John Cornyn is quoted by stating that it is only natural that elected officials and government leaders want recognition for their successes, but not for their failures. But we as a healthy democracy need to know the good, the bad, and the ugly. So this is meant to put it all out there, all the discussion, whether it's clean or dirty or what have you, because government can be a little messy too. A general rule, a governmental body's meetings all must be public. There is no informal meeting unless there's a specific statute that expressly permits an executive session, which is a closed-door meeting. And we'll talk more about that in a minute.
How do you define a meeting?
So we'll talk about that too. All right. No, perfect. So again, every regular, special, or called meeting of a governmental body must be open to the public, and the public must be given adequate notice of the topics to be discussed. There are no informal meetings. Okay, so what entities are subject to the act? So a governmental body is defined in the ordinance, and it provides some examples, which include a city council, a department, agency, or subdivision of a city, has authority that has an authority to create policy-making rules or decide contested cases. So the Planning and Zoning Commission is a governmental body, or Zoning Board of Adjustment. All of our city boards are considered governmental bodies, and all of their meetings are subject to this act. You'll see other public entities that are subject to these requirements, including local water boards, economic development authorities, and other quasi-public agencies. All right, so what is a quorum? A quorum is most of the time just a simple majority. So this essentially applies to the gathering of those governmental body members If public business is still deliberated or discussed, you have to have a quorum. For home rule, charter generally states that a quorum requirement is 3 or more people. So that's for a regular meeting. For a special meeting, where you're imposing taxes or adjusting the tax rate, you do have a higher threshold for the quorum, so it's 2/3. There's also type B, which is the mayor and 3 aldermen or 4 aldermen, and then type C, which is the majority of the Board of Commissioners, like this board here. So you guys only need 3 members present to conduct business. The zoning Board of Adjustment has to have 4 because of the way that the rules are set up, and they actually have to have 4 votes in affirmative to approve an action. So every board is a little bit different, but generally a simple majority is required. Right, what constitutes a meeting? So meeting occurs when a quorum, which is a majority of that governmental body, gathers. The public business that the governmental body has authority to supervise or oversee is discussed. And either A, a member of the governmental body participates in the discussion, or B, the governmental body call the meeting and conducts or is responsible for the meeting. So oftentimes we'll have public gatherings that aren't meant to be official city meetings, but we know there might be a quorum of city council or a quorum of the Planning and Zoning Commission. So we'll go ahead and notice for it. We'll go ahead and post an agenda just in case there's a quorum, so we don't get into trouble violating the Open Meetings Act. But we do explicitly state this is not an official meeting. No city business will be discussed, because oftentimes they just want to be present and just listen to the discussion, but they don't actually participate. So we've had a couple of those instances where we've had public forums and neighborhood meetings where we posted them as public meetings, quote unquote, because we knew there was a likelihood that Planning and Zoning Commission or City Council could have a majority there. The act does not apply to social functions or regional, state, or national workshops. So if you were going to a professional conference, I think next year, if the budget is approved, we have a few guys scheduled to go to a state planning conference, and we'll rotate you guys. So in that case, it wouldn't be considered a quorum, or if, for instance, the chamber puts on a lot of Live After 5 events and things like that, attending that as a majority would not be considered a quorum either, because you're there in a different function. Some examples include formal meeting, attendance at another entity's meeting, attendance at a city's board or committee meeting, so if you guys went to a council meeting, but there are 3 of you there. Social situations, staff briefings, using the restroom, walking quorum, circulating an invoice or letter for signature outside of a meeting email. And the Attorney General's advice is essentially to develop a habit of asking yourself, is this a meeting? And so I know with a small community like ours, everybody knows each other, so it can be very easy to kind of slip into that. And so sometimes there's a little more due diligence whenever you're thinking about what conversations that you're having. Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, please don't.
But I'm a lawyer.
If you would state your name and address and limit your time to 3 minutes. No, I'm kidding. Good evening, Judge.
Hi, guys. So you asked what is a meeting. Obviously, you're sitting in one right now. That's an easy one. The meeting she was talking about of going to any of the chamber things after Live After 5, or I don't know, you may all be in a church together and end up at the same meeting sometimes. Or
We have a quorum at church.
there you go. So that is enough people to constitute a quorum. And even though you're not there to have a meeting, you could accidentally slip into having one. And that's when you start talking about this stuff. So just because you're at one of these events that's not a meeting, don't let it become a meeting by starting to talk about this stuff. So,
When you say this stuff, are you talking about a specific case, or are you talking about generalities?
definitely a specific case is going to be the type of thing that's going to be, that has to be happening at a public meeting notice with people due process and all of that. But if you're also talking about policy changes that you think we should adopt, and you're starting to build a consensus of you all around new setback requirements, and you all are in church and you decide to pray about it. I hope not, but if that were something that were to occur, then that would be a deliberation which would take your social thing and turn it into a meeting, and that would violate the Open Meetings Act.
So specific policy changes would be part of
This stuff is definitely contested cases. It's definitely policy changes. Now, it starts to get fuzzier the further away you get from that.
Right.
But if it's the type of thing you're thinking about because you are a commissioner,
Exactly, yeah.
or the type of thing that you're thinking about because you want to make a change that you can do from this place, this position, then you probably don't want to be talking about it there. You want to be talking about it here. Does that help?
Yeah.
Okay.
It might take some discipline though.
Well, that's the hardest part of all of it, right?
Yeah, and that includes electronic communication, so group text, replying all to an email, those kind of things you have to be aware of too. So that's why we always blind copy you guys in email, so if you accidentally hit reply all, you don't fall into that.
Yeah, you're not gonna accidentally be creating a quorum. That's why you get the BCCs. Well, I'll give it back to you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. That's why he gets paid the big bucks. All right. So, ex parte communication. This is something that we didn't cover in our original workshop with the three of you guys who have been here for a year, because it doesn't come up that often, but I did want to make sure that we address it today. So, what is ex parte communication? It's essentially a discussion where only one side is presented. It states that any oral or written communication can be considered ex parte communication if it's outside the record of the hearing with either proponents or opponents of a pending proceeding. So if there's a zone change request and you're having a discussion with someone who's in opposition or in favor of the request, that could be considered ex parte communication if you're discussing the merits of the case. If someone's just providing you general comments and what they think about it, that's fine, and then you can share that with the rest of the commission. But you have to be careful about getting into deliberation, getting into comments on how you might vote or your support for that case. Those are things that aren't really appropriate for you guys to discuss outside of the public meeting. And so the reason that this is a concern is because the decision maker may be inaccurately informed. So you guys may be getting one side of the story, but that's not the whole story. And then you may be privy to information that the rest of the commission is not. And then the perception can be that the commission can be susceptible to improper influence. So even kind of the visual alone can affect the daily procedures and caseload of the commission. And so improper ex parte communication can also invalidate the actions of a commission. So if you guys are found to be in violation of that in regards to a specific case, that can have legal ramifications. So this might happen if you talk to an applicant or someone in opposition of a case outside of the regular proceedings of this kind of format, this public hearing. So just wanted to let you guys be aware of that, because I know you guys are still new and it's very easy to pick up the phone, but just make sure that when we're discussing an item that is scheduled for a future agenda, all of it's in this forum and it's open, and so everyone has access to the same information and we're all hearing the same discussion and deliberations. So again, save it for the public meeting. So are there any questions about this piece?
Yeah, I have a question
Yeah.
about that. So if the public is approaching us and discussing, I mean, it seems like we're here to represent the public. So if they're approaching us and sharing their thoughts with us and we're having a discussion with them, it seems like there's a fine line there. Where's that line? Is it, would it be me saying, well, I'm definitely not gonna support that, or I'm definitely going to support it? You know,
Well,
what's
that
the-
definitely crossed the line. You definitely stepped across the line there. The thing to do when somebody approaches you about a specific item on your upcoming agendas is, please come to the meeting. Or please put it in writing and give it to the planning department so all of my commissioners can hear it together. So that's the way to handle that. If you were to engage them, then you would be violating the ex parte rules.
And this is part of open meetings, or is this a separate law?
Is there a specific part of, this is in the statute somewhere, I don't know if it's open meetings or elsewhere. And all of us as public officials have it in different places. So I apologize, I don't have it specifically for you. The big thing about that, though, is the participants involved in the process don't want you to do an ex parte. They may not know that, because whatever you do that is done by ex parte can be undone. And you have to go back and do it all over again. So you're creating extra steps for them, whether they understand that or not. And you may have to explain that to them.
And I think a part of that is, so in a minute, we're gonna talk about equal protection under the law and how all participants should be treated equally. And so that's part of that, trying to treat all participants of the process equally by making all those discussions public and in an open forum. That's partial part of it, but it does kind of stem from those bad actors that we talked about earlier who are having behind closed door meetings or backdoor deals, and so it's to help avoid a lot of that stuff.
I'm still a little confused because we live in a small community and
Yep.
people come and talk to us and we talk to them and it's, it's,
And that's what you would do in a small community, or any community for that matter, is we as engaged citizens talk with our neighbors about what's going on and what we think's gonna happen, what we want to happen, things we think will make it better. We freely offer that, and that is part of living in a civil society. But you are now commissioner, and you have a slightly different role above and beyond being an engaged citizen. You're going to be making significant decisions that impact significant dollars for people, that influence their property rights. And so you have to hold yourself to a slightly different standard than what you would as an engaged citizen. And that means you've got to a degree, you've got to step back and ask them to step back and bring it to the appropriate process. Talking about process and how to engage the process is something every one of you should do. Anytime somebody comes up and says, I have a thought, explain how to get their thought into the process of decision-making. And there's easy ways to do it. They can send an email to Elena. They can write it all down in a letter. They can show up here and stand up here as you've invited people to talk to you. But the point is not to do it where it's not part of the process. Yeah.
so if someone sends me an email and I forward it to Ms. Lewis or Elena,
You've done what you needed to do.
that's okay.
That's exactly what you're supposed to
So
do.
then everybody on the commission will see it.
Correct. Now, you could say, thank you for your thoughts. I am sharing your comments with staff.
Yeah.
And that's a polite way to do it. And I
But
know
if it's only oral, then I can't share it?
if it's only oral, you can only encourage them to come here.
Or talk to Elena.
Yeah.
Well, I know when I had a zoning change in my neighborhood that I was working on, I called every commissioner and told them I was very concerned and why I was concerned, and I followed up with stuff in writing. But,
And that was shared with
right,
Elena.
So people are gonna call you and they're gonna tell you what they think.
It's gonna happen.
It's the two-way
well, I hope it
discussion.
happens.
Yeah.
Isn't that what's supposed to happen?
Yeah.
I mean, we want that to happen,
You-
right?
You're part of getting the information and their input into the process. But recognize that you're part of being there means getting it into the process, not just listening to it and engaging with it. So just listening to it is not enough. Engaging with it crosses the line. Getting them to show up here is an appropriate and a defensible thing to do.
And at our last meeting, I actually had several of you email me different correspondence you had with residences, and we compiled that, emailed it to the commission as a whole, and then provided copies at your place. And so that's a great example of where people were contacting different commissioners, and they were forwarding that written communication to staff, and then we shared it with the board as a whole. It made it part of the public record.
Okay, so it went from oral to being in writing, but I think earlier you had told me that it wouldn't be part of the 20% rule unless the person themselves sent it in writing.
Yeah, so the 20% rule is specified in our ordinance as well as statute.
Thank you, Rhonda.
I'm so sorry. I zoned out for just a second.
Turn it, can you
Would you
turn
repeat that
your,
again?
your mic?
Are y'all's mics working?
There we go. I'm so sorry.
Hello?
Would you repeat that last part again?
So the 20% rule,
Test.
she referenced the 20% rule, is spelled out in ordinance and statute. And to engage in the 20% rule, you have to meet the standards for the 20% rule. That's different than getting people to engage in the process and you all getting what they think. The 20% rule changes the,
The threshold for the majority vote for council.
it just simply changes the vote.
And
Thank
so what that 20% rule states is that if you're a property owner within 200 feet, you have to submit written opposition to be counted towards that 20%, and then, yeah, that triggers the supermajority vote.
So instead of just a majority of you voting, you gotta have 4 of you do it. So are you following, Mr. Perry?
I am. That was a hearing issue.
Good.
My ears, we haven't met yet. I haven't introduced myself. My ears don't function properly. It takes a lot of it, like lip reading and stuff like that. And I looked away for a second, and it was an important thing that I am still learning about, and I wanted to make sure that I was listening with focus.
Gotcha.
Thank you.
I think I've said all I need to say.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right, so the next one is examples, which we covered some of just now, but areas that could be a potential for trouble. So a serial meeting, also called a walking quorum, can be a series of communications, whether that's direct, technological, such as emails, telephone calls, or social media. Essentially, it can be walking and having a conversation or a group chat, something of that nature. Continuing the discussion after the meeting is adjourned is another kind of serial meeting. So after we've closed the public hearing, closed the meeting, but we're still discussing the merits of it afterwards. Replying all to case-related emails, so we talked about that earlier. So all your correspondence could be subject to discovery if there's legal action, and then failure to forward all applicable correspondence to designated staff for distribution and file. So again, you guys did great last time by forwarding that information to us. We put a copy in the case file and then made it part of the public record. So that's exactly what you guys should have done. Okay, notice requirements. And so this act does require us to provide written notice for all meetings, including date, time, and location, for both open meetings and executive sessions. And they have to be specific. So it must be sufficient to let the general public know of the subject matter that's being discussed, and then the date and time again, and how they can participate in the meeting. And so it talks about listings like personnel or new or old business. Those are generally insufficient because they're not specific enough. And so when we advertise for items, we're very specific as to the legal description, the lot and block, what use is proposed. We really get detailed on what those items are, so that there's no question as to what the board will be discussing. More important is the issue is to the public, so more specific the notice should be if it's a more public meeting, and then public forum or public comment is sufficient to hear from residents. So we have an open forum section of our agenda where anyone from the public can speak on any item that's not on the agenda, and they can just provide general comments to the commission. More on those notice requirements. So individual notice is typically not required. If there's an item on the agenda that's not part of a public hearing, we still have to post it on the agenda, which is 72 hours in advance. Public hearings like zone changes or amendments to our zoning code, those require additional notices in the newspaper, and some of them require written notices to the neighbors. But just a general workshop item like this is just a 72-hour notice on our agenda. Internet posting, cities are now required to post notices on city internet website. We also post ours in a Friday update, and so we'll push it out to our local media groups so they're aware of them as well. And when a city posts notice on its internet website, the physical notice still has to be readily accessible. So downstairs at City Hall, you'll find a physical copy in our display case, as well as electronic version online. Additional notice requirements, this won't really apply to you guys, but there are some circumstances where some boards or commissions may have an emergency meeting. And so there are some caveats to that allow for a shorter posting. These will probably be more like city council or emergency management entities where they're responding to an immediate threat to the public health. Also recesses, so the boards can take a recess and for the following business day, and so that can include things like just general agenda items, but you guys also do something similar where you're postponing items. So we've had a couple of zone changes where they were postponed to a set definite future meeting. So that might be an example of a recess. Record keeping, we have to keep minutes of all public meetings. We have to state the subject of each deliberation and then indicate vote, order, decision, or other action taken, and then just provide a brief summary. So our minutes aren't meant to be like a transcript. They're meant to capture the main talking points, and then you guys review those at your following meeting and sign them to make them official. Okay, procedures and requirements for open meetings. Again, a meeting may not be convened unless a quorum is present. So in this case, for you guys, it's a simple majority, 3 people. They are required to have ADA access to the physical room, and so we do have ADA access to this facility. Members of the public, including the media, have a right to record the meeting by audio or videotape. So sometimes you'll see reporters with video cameras in city council meetings. We also record these meetings for the public, and oftentimes you'll see that local reporters just watch the video and then they report on it in the paper the following day. A governmental body may adopt reasonable rules to maintain order in a meeting, including those related to the location or of recording equipment. So the Planning and Zoning Commission doesn't have a formal rules and procedures for meetings, and so that allows you some flexibility in how you conduct them, but it's just important to stay consistent. So we do generally follow Robert's Rules of Order, and we do typically follow the same order of agenda items and our process as far as public hearing and allowing the public to comment. More procedures and requirements. The act does not entitle members of the public to speak at open meetings, and so we do have an open forum section, and anything slated for public hearing is open to public comment. If we do allow public comment, we may set reasonable rules. So at council, you'll see that they initially will tell the public to limit comments to 3 minutes. We'll often do that too if we see it's a large gathering. We know we're going to have a lot of public comment. And so you do have the prerogative to kind of put a cap on those just for the sake of maintaining the order of the meeting. If a member of the public asks a question about an item that's not on the agenda, the board cannot deliberate on that item. So oftentimes people will come to these public forums and they'll have a complaint about street construction, or they'll have general drainage concerns. And so those aren't items that are on the agenda slated for discussion, but they are items where staff can provide clarification or statement of fact regarding the comment. We can provide clarifications on policy regarding the issue that was brought up, or you guys can propose to place it on a future agenda item for deliberation. And so those are different ways that their answers can get addressed, or if you guys want to talk about it at a future meeting, we can schedule that as well. Any questions about that? All right. So executive sessions. This board won't have as many executive sessions, if any, as city council does, because these are typically limited to special uses. So again, you do have to have a quorum to properly convene an open meeting. We have to announce that a closed meeting will be held. So if we have an executive session, we have to announce publicly that, hey, we're going to have a closed session meeting. We have to identify in the open meeting the section of the law that allows closed meetings. So those are very specific criteria, and we'll talk about that in a minute. We have to have a certified agenda, a tape recording, and the agenda must include a statement of the subject for each deliberation and a record of any further action taken. A sitting member of the governmental body may review the certified agenda or tape recording. So these executive sessions are limited to governmental body members, as well as essential staff that are needed to discuss the matters. It may not admit a person whose presence is against the interest of the governmental body that the closed meeting is designed to protect. So this is meant to allow for attorney-client privilege discussions, economic development discussions, discussing personnel matters, things that wouldn't typically be subject to public information. And this just gives some examples. And so real property deliberations, if there's a situation where the city is interested in purchasing a piece of property or selling a piece of property, that might be a topic that could fall under executive session privileges. Personnel matters, so deliberation of appointment, employment, or evaluation of staff. So in this case, city council, some of the staff that reports directly to city council is city manager, city attorney, and I believe the city secretary, or does she report to Mario? She reports to Mario. Okay, so, but they do appoint department heads such as police chief, fire chief, so those may be some examples of some closed sessions that they may conduct. Again, economic development, a consultation with attorney in the security or homeland security measures. Again, this probably wouldn't apply to you guys, but just some examples of the different types of things that could fall under executive session. So violation, the act provides for civil remedies and criminal penalties for noncompliance. Criminal provisions are enforced by the district attorney, county attorney, and criminal district attorneys. And the attorney general is not directly authorized to enforce Open Meetings Act, so typically it's local prosecutors who are responsible for that. Civil penalties, so an action taken in violation of the act is voidable. And so any voidable action may be redone at a later meeting. That action will not be given retroactive effect. So if you guys had a zoning case before you and during those proceedings you were found to be in violation of the Open Meetings Act, we may have to go through that process again, but it doesn't have, again, a retroactive effect. And another example could be termination of an employee, but again, that's like a city council item. And that's something that you guys wouldn't necessarily have purview over. Other civil actions include any interested person may bring a civil suit against an official to comply with the act, to enjoin officials from acting, or to avoid actions taken in illegal meeting. A person injured by unlawful disclosure of a certified agenda or tape recording or lawfully closed meeting may sue for damages, attorney fees, and exemplary damages. Do you guys have any questions about that piece? No? All right. Again, criminal proceedings, so participating in a closed meeting, knowing that there's an agenda or tape recording is not being made. So again, we always record not only audio but visual. But whenever you guys are having these meetings, a strong indicator of if it's in violation if there's no one taking minutes or there's no one recording the meeting. In general, knowingly disclosing an agenda or tape recording of a closed meeting to a member of the public is also in violation. So, for example, city council, they have executive sessions. If they were to disclose that to people outside of that body, that could also be seen as a violation. All right, we're almost done. Knowingly conspiring to circumvent the act. So basically getting together and creating a plan to violate the Open Meetings Act or have a private meeting. Knowingly aiding and calling, or organizing an unlawful closed meeting, so trying to make arrangements to meet privately to discuss an item, would also be in violation. All right, these are some current resources, and all this information was also in your binder. So in your binder, we provided a copy of this PowerPoint, and if you guys don't have any questions on that, we're going to talk about development as actions in local government code. Hi, yes.
Of course, I have a question. So going back to the ex parte, which my understanding is that it's not part of open meetings, and I would be interested in seeing the ex parte law or whatever regulation that applies to us. But Mr. Kirkland said that we can't discuss policy matters, but we don't set policy, we make recommendations. So does that, like, I want to talk to my city council person about policy that is relevant to some of the decisions we're making, because they might be the ones that decide on an ordinance.
You can do that.
Yeah, so I just wanted to clarify the difference between policy and recommendations that we do, because we don't set policy.
So the argument I'm going to make if you're accused of violating the Open Meetings Act is that that wasn't a final decision. City Council had to make that.
Right.
So you didn't violate it because you did it. I don't want you to be in the position of me having the conversation with you saying, this is a personal matter, you have to hire your own lawyer. And if you avoid these lines, then we don't have to have that conversation. Two, it is possibly a defense if you're just merely making a recommendation. It's better if you get the stuff here, and we don't have to make that argument.
But what about me talking to my city council people, representatives, about policy
You making a
that
recommendation.
overlaps with?
Oh, yeah,
yeah.
that's cool. That's cool. That's you
Okay.
as a citizen
Right, okay.
talking to your council
Okay,
member.
so it's more about the things that we have decision-making ability on.
If it's a policy that you as a body were going to recommend to your city council member,
Okay.
then it gets fuzzier, but you can make your own recommendation to your city council members. But that's not the decision of the body to make the recommendation. Do you understand the difference?
Yes, I think so.
Okay,
Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, I do in my own mind, but I just don't know if it's the same, the same understanding that you have, so.
So
but
you
I
as,
think I do.
you as a citizen want to adopt a change to lot sizes.
Yeah.
You make a proposal to this board that we should study lot sizes. The board says, let's study lot sizes. They come up with it's all presented, recommendations are made, staff has analyzed it, you all have a series of choices and you come down on a decision. as a board, you've collectively decided this is where we think it should be, and you're making that recommendation to city council to change the lot size. You have your own thoughts about it, and you choose to speak to city council members about your own thoughts about it. That's legit,
Okay, perfect, thank you.
okay?
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you, sir.
You have a question? All right.
No, I was saying thank you.
Oh. All right, well, that concludes the portion about Open Meetings Act, so we're gonna move on.
Actually, let's take one more point here,
Alright.
and I forgot to put this out. So there are going to be numerous occasions where you all are invited to sit and listen to other people talk about policy. NAC Together is a big one that's heavy on, going to be big in your world, and it's something that you'll have a lot of influence on. And it is okay for you to attend. It is okay for you to listen. I would encourage you to make sure that they're the big ones that everybody's invited to, but they don't have to be just that. They can be smaller ones, an individual neighborhood or something like that. The thing to do is to ensure that you are not engaging in a two-way street. You are simply listening.
Are you saying we can't give input at these meetings?
No, at the big meetings, I'm saying no, don't give input at those meetings because you have a role in that process of getting what they're generating to city council and making it part of the process. Your input will come at the appropriate stage through acting collectively. Listening to the discussion, though, is also valid for how you reach that decision when you get here. Am I helping you?
Well, it seems to be contrary to what you just said about me being able to go to my city council person and discuss policy. And now you're saying I couldn't express my opinion in an open, public meeting.
You can express your opinion at a public meeting of city council. If you are attending a general public meeting, then that's where expressing your opinion gets close to the line of are you deliberating outside of this meeting or not?
And is that ex parte or is that open meetings?
That's open meetings. Ex parte is where your fellow commissioners aren't hearing and somebody from one side or another is approaching you. A chamber meeting where everybody's sitting there and they're talking about something. You all are there just to get information and to hear information, and that's legit. The problem is, at a chamber meeting, if you start engaging with the chamber members about the specifics of the policy that they're trying to recommend, then you're pushing over into the line of, I'm not there receiving information, I'm now crossed over into deliberations. And when you cross over into deliberations have to occur in a notice meeting of this body.
If it specifically concerns a zoning issue.
If it concerns a matter that is within the power of this body.
Okay.
So examples are not just individual zoning requests, but changes to our zoning code, changes to our subdivision ordinance, changes to our sign ordinance, amendments to the comprehensive plan. You guys have a lot of purview over a lot of different elements of our development process. And I know it's probably challenging for some of you who are probably neighborhood representatives or leaders in your social networks and are probably accustomed to people using you as a resource and coming to you for information like that. And so it can be, I understand it can be difficult to shift because your roles are different now. And so just another layer of scrutiny and.
Yeah, you've gone from being an advocate to being a decider. And that's the difficult transition for a lot of us. You know, when I was first appointed judge, I had been an advocate for my community, and I had to learn to govern my mouth. Yeah, that was hard. It was hard. Fortunately, it was 30 years ago, and, now it's sort of second nature. And it will become second nature for you. It doesn't mean you don't have opinions. It doesn't mean you don't advocate in the appropriate place. It just means that you have to be cautious about how you do that. So your advocacy is here with your fellows and upwards to city council and when they act upon what you come up with.
Thank you.
Okay? Yeah.
And I think essentially because of the influence you now have, you're held to a higher standard. So it's just a community member or neighborhood leader, you weren't subject to these requirements, but now that you're a public official, it's just another layer of scrutiny and transparency, which I think we all want. It can just be a difficult transition. So that's, especially in your first year or two, it's understandable that you guys will unknowingly have a conversation with someone with no malintent. So it's just something I think, like Steve said, with practice, you'll just become more accustomed to it. And if you ever have any questions, you can reach out to me and Steve and ask. So don't hesitate. All right. So. All right, fun stuff. Development is actions. So what we're going to talk about is the Texas Local Government Code and the authority that it gives home rule cities to regulate private land development. And so that starts with zoning. And so again, you guys know what zoning is, but for the benefit of the public, we're going to talk a little bit more about it. And so essentially zoning is the division of a city or area into districts and prescription and application of different land use regulations in each district. So breaking the city up into districts that are regulated by different land uses. So industrial, single family, multifamily. And this is an exercise of the police power that allows cities to regulate the rights of a private individual for the good of the community. So what is zoning? We provided an image of the zoning map. And so zoning regulations govern the use of land and the location, size, and height of buildings. It divides the jurisdiction in multiple districts, with each one containing distinct set of regulations that are uniformly applied to all property within that district. A zoning ordinance consists of a text specifying the regulations and map defining the location of districts. And I'm going to ask for pause for just one moment. All right, so what is the relationship of zoning to the comprehensive plan? Which comes first? Again, comprehensive planning, we talked about it before, but this looks at more than just the physical design of a community. It also looks at the interrelationship of land use, infrastructure, community facilities, and community programs. So it's a much higher level planning tool. And that relates to the subdivision regulation and zoning ordinance as implementation of that comprehensive plan. So again, zoning regulates use, lot size, setbacks, and heights. Plats regulate street and lot layout and infrastructure. So these are tools meant to implement those priorities, policies, goals, and objectives of the comprehensive plan. And so zoning tells you what you can do today, and the comprehensive plan is more aspirational, setting goals and the future vision of the city, which again is then implemented through subdivision and zoning regulations. So just a brief history on zoning. Zoning is a valid exercise of the police power to protect the community's health, safety, and welfare. It was initially started in New York as a way to control overcrowding and allow for adequate air, space, light, because in essence people were being forced into these small buildings that didn't have a lot of livable area, there weren't sanitary conditions, so it was meant for a way to provide more sanitary living conditions and separation between those uses that just aren't compatible. So brief history on Texas zoning. So each state has its own zoning enabling act. Ours is a standard zoning enabling act of 1926, and there's some case law that just provides some examples of that police power. And so Lombardo versus City of Dallas found that all property is held subject to this police power. A proper zoning regulation is not a taking for which compensation must be paid. So if you have a proper zoning regulation that applies to all properties within that district, it's not considered a taking. But when we start treating properties differently that are in that same district, that's when we get into the fuzzy stuff. And so these are the different chapters of the local government code that give the cities our authority to regulate private land development. So Chapter 211 is the municipal zoning authority. Chapter 212 is the municipal regulation of subdivisions, so plating. And then Chapter 213 is municipal comprehensive plans. And so the purpose, again, is to promote public health, safety, morals, or general welfare, and protecting and preserving places and areas of historical, cultural, and architectural importance and significance. And so this gives the city some broad authority to help preserve and protect certain elements of the community. Different types of zoning include, maybe not, standard districts, so your R4, your single-family overlay districts, like your historic overlay districts, or corridor overlays. And then other special districts may be small area neighborhood plans, or in some larger metroplexes, they have an art district or economic development district that serves special planning purposes. So, and again, specific use permits. So these aren't a change in the zoning, but just allows approval of additional land use that wouldn't normally be permitted based on physical conditions or circumstances surrounding the property. And then form-based code is another type of zoning that doesn't necessarily regulate the land use. So it doesn't necessarily look at what's happening inside the building, but it looks at the built form. So it looks at your building setbacks, the scale of buildings, kind of the physical character of the development versus the actual uses that are going on inside the building. So that's a distinction. And so, again, the city may divide municipality into districts of a number, shape, and size. The regulations must be uniform for each class or kind of building in a district. So all properties in the B2 General Business District shall be treated equally. The regulations may vary from district to district, though. So you're allowed to treat single-family different than you're allowed to treat commercial versus how you're allowed to treat industrial. The regulations must be adopted with reasonable consideration, among other things, for the character of each district and its peculiar suitability for particular uses with a view of conserving the value of buildings and encouraging the most appropriate use of land in the municipality. So this essentially says that you can treat districts differently because of the different nature of the uses that are allowed within those districts. So you can be more restrictive of industrial uses than you can of agricultural uses based on the particular uses that are within that district. And then you have planned development districts, which are their own unique zoning district, where a development can be very specific to a property, and the zoning is specifically for that development. And then specific use permits, which we just talked about.
Do we have districts here? Just the downtown district, is that the only district?
So so we have the historic overlay districts, which one of those is the downtown.
That's an
And
overlay.
yes, ma'am. And then we have two corridor overlay districts. Those are urban core overlay districts that are properties that are fronting portions of North Street and University. And those areas have additional provisions for reductions in parking, but then additional requirements for sidewalks. So the idea is those commercial corridors, as they develop or redevelop, are made more pedestrian friendly with new construction of sidewalks, but then that's offset by reduction in vehicular parking, because the idea is if it's more walkable, you don't need as many parking spaces. So there's a caveat to that. And then, those are really the only districts that come to mind. Other cities
Is there a hospital district?
Yes, so that's a taxing district. That's different. That's not a zoning district.
It started as a zoning district.
It did. Okay. So when we look at the hospital district, we just look at the zoning, which has its own medical zoning. But a tax district, that's a different entity, different body. So we don't necessarily have any influence on that. But for instance, a lot of cities have economic development districts. They'll have design districts, things like that, that are designed to create a certain look or character of an area or provide certain financial incentives for development. So there's a lot of different types. So as far as what cities can regulate, so the Texas Local Government Code tells us what we can regulate as far as private development. So we can regulate height, number of stories, and size of buildings and other structures. We can also regulate the percentage of a lot that may be occupied, so essentially lot coverage. We can regulate the size of yards, so like building setbacks, courtyards, other open spaces. We can regulate the population density. So in the zoning ordinance, you'll see like number of units per acre that density, location and use of buildings, other structures, and land for business, industrial, residential, or other purposes. In areas of historical, cultural, or architectural significance, we can regulate the construction, reconstruction, and alteration of raising of buildings or structures. So in the historic overlay, any exterior renovations or new construction has to go through our Historic Landmark Preservation Committee, and they have a different set of regulations. Home rule cities may also regulate the bulk of buildings, so that's generally, again, related to size. Up until 2019, cities could regulate building materials outside of historical and cultural districts, and then the state passed a law that essentially stripped cities of that power unless it was already designated as a historical district or some sort of other cultural district. So when we get for example, from time to time, we'll have planned development districts, and if it's in an area that's already designated as culturally significant or historically significant, then the commission could impose conditions on architecture or building materials, but if it's not, then we don't really have the authority to do so. So we have to be careful whenever we're looking at those. The reason that got stripped away is there were a lot of large metroplex areas that were becoming very strict on the types of building materials that were allowed. For example, whenever I was in Frisco, you had a 90% masonry requirement. So masonry meant cementitious material, brick, stone, and essentially created kind of this separate market for building materials, and the state found that that was inappropriate, and so that's why we don't have that authority anymore. That could come back. Future legislations could give us that authority back, but for now, it's only restricted to historical and cultural areas that were designated at that time. So, when we look at designated future historical districts, we may or may not be able to regulate the building materials. Perhaps architecture and design and style, but not the actual building materials. Zoning ordinance components include use regulations, so the different land uses that can take place on the property. Again, districts, the number and type of districts, approval procedures, and then development standards. And development standards include lot area, setbacks, lot width, heights, dwelling area. So some cities actually regulate the size of the building with like minimum area for single-family homes, densities, parking, landscaping, open space, tree preservation, lighting and glare, screening and fencing, urban design, and environmental issues. So those are just some examples of different elements that you might find within the zoning code. Subdivision regulations are intended to provide for the conversion of raw land into buildable lots. So making sure when people are actually dividing up land, that each lot has adequate access to infrastructure, including roadways, water, sewer, and drainage, and that we're not creating landlocked parcels or parcels that are undevelopable. So again, the subdivision ordinance has requirements for public improvements like streets, water, sewer. Other cities actually have requirements for public sidewalks, and so every community varies. And so you may have kind of the core standards for each city, but then some cities regulate more, some cities regulate less, and so you'll see variations from community to community. It also outlines submittal and procedural requirements for approval of subdivision plats, and these are important because our subdivision regulations really shape development because it dictates the number of lots, the size of lots, the configuration of those lots, how streets are built, and so it really informs kind of the urban fabric of a community, how it feels walking down the street, driving down the street. So the subdivision regs, we don't talk about them a lot, but they are critical to our process because they determine the physical shape and function of the community. And they have a lasting impact on community design. So once a subdivision is built, it's usually there forever. And it may be redeveloped over time in portions, but they last a long time.
Is there a minimum number of lots that triggers something from being just some single-family housing to a planned development or a subdivision? And what is a planned development in relation to a subdivision?
So planned development is a zoning district, where a subdivision is essentially the division of land, of raw land. So a planned development will give you or grant you permissions for land uses that can take place on that property. And it might include a plan that shows subdivision. That plan may include specific lot size, densities, but not always. Sometimes they're for commercial or sometimes they're for multifamily. Whereas a subdivision regulation looks at like straight zoning, like a R1 or R2, and applies the regulations to that district based on its zoning. And so subdivision regulations apply to all property in the city, even in our extraterritorial jurisdictions. So even outside the city, we have some subdivision authority where we can regulate how people divide their property, because essentially that is the future boundaries of the city. So we want to make sure it's providing for orderly growth and development. So planned development is zoning, land use, whereas subdivision is actually dividing up the land and building the infrastructure. But oftentimes, planned developments will include a subdivision plan if they're proposing something that's outside of our ordinance. So oftentimes you'll have a proposal that'll be more dense than what we allow or provide for alternative design. And so that's when you see those subdivision plans in a planned development district.
So is there a minimum number of lots being developed all at once that kicks it into a PD?
No, ma'am. There's no minimum lot size. There's no minimum number of lots. Some cities do have minimum acreage. So, for instance, when I worked in College Station, you had to have 5 acres in order to submit for a planned development district. Some cities it's less, some cities it's more. Some don't have a minimum lot requirement because planned developments are also appropriate for infill, where maybe you have a vacant lot, but it's in the middle of an established neighborhood, and there need to be some considerations made for that infill. So then a PD might be appropriate for that, versus a big piece of raw land that really will be like a brand-new development. So in the future, we could adopt some additional restrictions on lot size or acreage for planned developments, but right now we don't. And that varies from city to city. All right. So relationship to the comprehensive plan. So the zoning ordinance and subdivision regulations are an important tool for comprehensive plan implementation. Essentially, the comprehensive plan provides legal and practical basis for subdivision regulations. Consistency with the plan avoids arbitrary or discriminatory regulations. And plan coordinates subdivision layout with other community development. And so if you have a currently adopted or recently adopted comprehensive plan, that's a great time to update your codes, because you just went through that public engagement process, you've got that community buy-in, it's at the top of the mind of the local governmental body, and you know you're gonna have that support because those priorities and goals just came from all that public engagement. And so it makes it very easy to pass changes to our ordinances because you've already heard kind of that public consensus on what the community wants to see. So essentially, if you have zoning or subdivision regulations that are in stark contrast to your comprehensive plan, well, you probably need to update your comprehensive plan or look at how you're doing your zoning and subdivision regulations. But they are meant to be married, as in you have a comprehensive plan that provides your kind of big picture vision for how the community should grow. Your zoning and subdivision helps you implement that vision through minimum lot sizes, through land uses, through different provisions in your development code. Any questions about that? All right, so making a zoning, how does this relate to making a zoning decision? So at this time, I'm going to ask Mr. Kirkland to talk about the 14th and 5th Amendment as it applies to due process for our zoning process, and Chapter 211 Local Government Code as it relates to people who have a personal or property interest in an action. And I'll go over these slides, but I'll ask Steve Kirkland to come up and provide some additional detail. So the 14th Amendment provides that states and cities shall not deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction equal protections of the law. And so this requires all persons similarly situated to be treated similarly in equal protection. So when we talk about the zoning process, it's the applicant, it's those property owners that are within 200 feet, it's the commission, and so the idea is you each have equal protection under that due process law. So that's why we kind of harp on Open Meetings Act, and those procedural things, because everybody should benefit from those same legal protections. Does that make sense? Steve, did you want to expand upon that?
Can I ask, I'm sorry, can I just go back a little bit to the comprehensive plan? I know we've talked about it, that after the comprehensive plan, there's I guess an understanding, according to what you've said, that a lot of ordinances will be updated to reflect what's in the plan. Is that, is there any mechanism that encourages that to happen, or is that strictly at the will and, I guess, time availability of city council? How is there a process for that, or is there any requirement for it, or is it just Hey, we'll do it.
Yeah, so I'm going to answer that question in a couple of different ways. So it varies from community to community. And so previous cities that I worked on, after the comprehensive plan was adopted, an ordinance change was made to incorporate implementation of that, to actually codify it and dictate it. So when staff retired and went away, or you had new council, the ordinance still was in place. So, for example, in College Station, we had an annual review of the comprehensive plan, and we're required to provide a report to the Planning and Zoning Commission and City Council on how that plan was being implemented every year through capital improvement projects, through zoning cases. And so it was a way to provide some accountability to staff and the commission on, hey, here's the work that we did this year on implementing different elements of the comprehensive plan. And so there's a lot of different reasons why things get implemented and why they don't. Some of them come down to funding. So for public infrastructure, streets, water, sewer, a lot of those are very costly projects. And so sometimes through no action of the city, some of those never come to fruition. Others may be a lack of political will. So, and that can vary from community to community, where one council approves a comprehensive plan, maybe the next council, their priorities are a little bit different, so they're not as motivated to implement some of those strategies. Some of it is a requirement for cooperation with other entities. So the city can't be responsible for implementing an entire comprehensive plan. A lot of those require partnerships with other interlocal agencies. Some of those are driven by private development that the city doesn't necessarily have control over. And so the timing of those is really important. And so I think when we get done with this comprehensive plan update process, we're going to be moving forward with a recommendation to actually update our zoning code to write in a requirement to have an annual review and presentation and report to the Planning and Zoning Commission and City Council every year to talk about, here's what was approved, here's what we have done and haven't, and why. Kind of go through that public evaluation. So that'll help provide some accountability. And there's some other different tools that you can do to help kind of ensure that things are moving along and it's not just being put on a shelf and collecting dust. But there's a lot of different reasons and ways things can be taken forward. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, it sounds like the ordinance at College Station was for an annual review, but not an actual firm requirement that any particular ordinance be passed.
So it was a 5-year update of the entire comprehensive plan. And then every year it was a report of what we've implemented and what we haven't and why. Because those comprehensive plans, at least good current ones, have specific timelines for when action should be taken. It'll have short-term, mid-term, and long-term goals. It'll include specific action plans for who's involved, when they're involved, how much money will be spent, and how long it'll take. One of the challenges of our 2003 comprehensive plan, it's very aspirational in nature. It doesn't provide a lot of actionable steps to achieve those goals. So that's something that is going to be different with this comprehensive plan update, is a comprehensive implementation strategy that'll provide some real-world tools on, hey, here's what you're going to implement the first year and how. Here's what you're going to implement in year 5 and how. So that's something that not all comp plans are created equal. And so we'll be looking for that in our comp plan update. And it'll also include, I imagine, recommendations for changes to our ordinance to create committees, oversight committees for the comprehensive plan, and make sure that we don't forget about it once it's approved.
Thank
Is
you.
that all right?
That's what I wanted to hear.
All right,
That's great.
good deal. So when does an individual have a property interest? So Chapter 211 of the Local Government Code states that if you are a property owner of the property being rezoned, or if you own property within 200 feet of the property being rezoned, then you are deemed to have a property interest in that governmental action. So home rule cities may provide different rules. So generally that interest provides that individual protection under the law of that kind of due process, and also provides them some additional tools for appealing those decisions and bringing a case forward. But if you don't have a property interest, then you don't have the same protections as someone who does. So just wanted to provide that clarification. The Fifth Amendment provides that private property shall not be taken for public use without just compensation. And so there's typically 2 types of claims for taking by a municipality. One involves an actual physical invasion of private property. The other is a diminution, I can't speak today, in development rights on property by virtue of some regulatory action by the city. So if by some action of the city, you're limiting the development rights of an individual, that could be considered a taking, depending on the nuances of the case. And then present illustration. So in this example, a city passes an ordinance which requires a landowner permit for a small cable TV connection box in connection by company upon payment to property owner of a nominal fee. So essentially, this is just an example. It's not necessarily related to zoning, but this would be something that city council would probably have more purview over as far as fines and things of that nature. But another example could be if you had a development regulation that applied to all properties within the same district, and then you had a proposal for something that was maybe an increase in the density or an increase in the intensity of the use, but you treated that property differently than the others. So I think a lot of it, what it boils down to is consistency with your regulations and how you apply them. So making sure that that people are treated equally, who are also in equal circumstance or similar circumstances. So again, it can vary from case to case. It's very nuanced. Back in Kirkland, there he is. Thank you.
You were just about to ask me to come up
Yes, I
to,
was.
to start talking, give you a break, is that it?
Take a deep breath,
Take a
sit
drink,
down.
yeah, have a drink of water or something like that. So the key to, the thing to think about here is something that you're doing with respect to a decision you're making going to impact a property owner differently than it would impact the general public. So if you have a rule that says nobody in this area gets more than 2 stories, and someone comes in and says, I need 3 stories to make it work, and you decide to let them have that, you're treating them differently, you're giving them special consideration. Or, more likely, you come in and they want their 2 stories, but there's something on their property that gets in the way of their 2 stories. Say they're on a slope, and one end of the property looks like 2 stories, and one end of the side of the property looks like 3 stories. So you're saying, no, you only get 2 stories from the back side as opposed to the front side. Downslope as opposed to upslope. Then you've imposed a cost on them that is different than the rest of that subdivision. That would be what's known as an exaction, or that would be what's known as a regulatory taking. So you've diminished the ability of them to develop their property in a way that's unique to them without applying the rules across that same zone the same way.
Well, since rules change over time, we're talking about the rules that are in effect at that time.
Right. So the regulatory taking is where you diminish the ability of them to develop the property in some way. So if you were to adopt a new rule that applied across the city requiring a certain amount of open space, that's not impacting anybody differently than the other folks. That's not regulatory taking. It may get everybody in this room and city council unelected or not. It may get everybody, coronated. I don't know how the citizens will react to that, but it applies across the board and everybody gets the same credit or blame, right? But if you were to start focusing that open space requirement down to, say, the floodplains, which is a likely area of wanting to regulate, then you're starting to impact property owners differently than the rest of them. And the line between it being a regulatory taking influencing their property and an outright exaction becomes harder and fuzzier. Harder to find and fuzzier to define. If you have floodplain regulations that are already in place and you're following them, no biggie, right? You're applying the existing rules. But if you start to change the rules, then you're going to have the more challenges. Now, once you've changed the rules and you apply them, that's great. so long as somebody hasn't overturned your process for getting the rules adopted. If you then were to take a piece of property within the floodplain and decide you need additional limitations on their ability to use it for some reason, then you're looking at what's clearly an exaction, and that's a taking. So essentially, the rule is set up so that things that are public goods, unimpeded floodways, are available to us as a public, but we collectively pay for it. We don't impose that cost on individuals. Now, it gets more complicated because it's law, and it's constitutional, and it's property rights, right? So you can have specific sorts of exactions on a particular parcel, but it has to be related to the development of that particular parcel. An example would be 10 acres, city subdivision rules require a street be cut in there. And the street has to be dedicated. That's an exaction, but it's an exaction that can be imposed on the property owner because it allows the property owner to sell the rest of the property. That's an easy understanding of that. Bigger parcels, you can actually go so far as to require parks and a certain amount of green space and still be constitutionally okay. So when you start focusing down on smaller parcels and say, you know, you really don't need to have that much concrete on this particular parcel for some very good reason, but you don't have a rule that prescribes it across the board, then you're looking at, that's a regulatory taking, that's an exaction, and you're going to have to compensate that landowner. On a good day, you get to compensate the landowner and you get what you want. On a bad day, you get mud in your face, the rule is, the decision is overturned, they get to do what they want, and you get to pay their lawyers. So, apply the rules across the board. If you see something that's come up and brought to you in a particular development that looks like a problem, and that happens a lot of times, you know, we don't always see the problems until somebody's trying to do something. And they're doing it in a way that says, wait a minute, that's going to create problems downstream. We need to address this. And you want to do something with that parcel. Most of the time, you need to not do something with that parcel. You need to look at your rules, adopt new rules so that you're addressing that going further. All right, so one other nuance to throw into it. You can try to harmonize existing uses with the new use. And that's known as conditional zoning. You approve a zone change but place a condition on it. The types of conditions that you can do without violating the Fifth Amendment are the ones that harmonize adjoining landowners. So, you've got a subdivision where the entrance to the subdivision has a big lot that never got developed. It was zoned for something light, and somebody with a little bit more heavy and that doesn't quite fit what the light zoning would be wants to come in. You're inclined to grant it, but it creates a problem. The neighbors behind it or object to it, so they're giving you neighborhood grief. One of the ways you can harmonize those things is by putting up a fence or some kind of barrier that removes the basic objections, say lights, noise, dust. Stuff like that that would cause problems for the adjoiners. You could approve the zone change but impose the conditions. That is not the best way to do that. The best way to get harmony between adjoining uses that don't necessarily mesh up is through the PD process. And the way you get that is essentially there's a lot of different things that people can put on the table, and they can pick and choose what makes them the most happy. When I spent a month at Harvard, and we learned about the Pareto principle of negotiating. It's where if you get enough stuff on the table, there's enough things in there that everybody wants a piece of. Most people can get something, or they can get the most things that they place the most value on, they can come away happy even if they didn't come away with a straight up or down vote. But that process can play out in a PD. It can't play out in a conditioned zoning. Now, if it's obvious the solution is a fence, that's not a hard one. You can do that. She'll probably even recommend it to you. But if you start to go anything beyond that, then you really are looking at a different type of process you need to engage.
But you can't require that somebody go through,
No,
enter the PD,
you cannot.
yeah. So they have, do they choose it, or how does it get decided what developments become PDs?
Well, they choose it. It could be suggested as a way to avoid the problem with the neighbors. It's like, they're not going to like this. And these folks aren't going to be able to fix it for you. You might want to think about this process where you can offer them different things.
Most, so those processes are initiated by the private property owner, or someone who's interested in purchasing the property. Usually PDs are very specific to a development plan. Someone knows exactly what it is that they want to build. And so, or they want to do something that doesn't fit into our regulations. So a development that wouldn't be permitted by right in any of our zoning districts, so they have to create their own to allow for special permissions. Or if it's trying to accommodate context-sensitive design. So for example, Hetty Leg on Mound Street, that initially came forward as a straight zone change. And due to everything around it being developed and kind of a certain character, we worked with them to submit a PD to do exactly what they wanted, but provide some assurances to the neighbors on how it was going to look and the scale to make sure it blended in with the existing neighborhood. So those are some different examples, especially that one because it was very kind of compact and it was going to have a big effect. Anything on that property was going to, have a big effect on those neighbors because they were literally like 10 feet away. So those are some different examples of when someone may initiate a zone change, or we may work with the applicant to submit that if they know exactly what it is that they're wanting to do.
So the likelihood is even in that process, you're not going to make everybody happy, but everybody's going to get a little something. And hopefully most people will get enough that they walk away with more happiness than they would have if you'd had an up or down vote.
That makes sense.
Yeah. What else do I need to say about this?
In a little bit.
Come back with another one? Oh, yeah, all right, cool.
Can I just clarify that, you said earlier in the presentation that zoning, it does not constitute a taking. So if, for example, floodplains were zoned as a special overlay district with development rules that pertain to them, then so that would be a way, I guess how would that impact existing properties? Would you have to buy those properties from the landowners, or would they still?
Not necessarily. Not
Okay.
necessarily. It's possible that you could enact a floodplain ordinance such that you have totally eviscerated any economic value of the properties for the individual property owner. Of course, it has huge economic value perhaps to the community, but you're taking it from an individual property owner and then divesting that person and giving it to the community, and that would be a straight up taking. A lot of floodway management is done that way. It's just, we're going to condemn your property, or we're going to condemn it and take a floodway easement, which gives us the right to control what kind of development you have on there, essentially making it only pasture land or other forms of green space. So there was a specific zoning case came out of Oregon where the guy wanted to develop property both in and out of the floodway. Significant chunk of it was in the floodway, but the development they wanted was to really intensify its its use from a smaller hardware store to a hardware store and coffee shop and all the things that Portland is famous for, including, bike stands. And they had two forms of regulations that the zoning commission tried to impose on the development. One was not only a setback from the floodway, but 15 feet above the floodway had to be non-developed and open for public use.
Elevation-wise?
Elevation-wise, yeah, 15 feet above. Which, actually, given the rain they've been having, that probably was wise, but. And then they also placed a bike lane component on the front end. The bike lane component probably was gonna help his business, but it still cost him money, so he fought it. And he took it all the way up to Supreme Court, and both of those, while they're the types of stuff that can be regulated, they can't be regulated on an individual parcel basis. And by doing it that way, it was an exaction, it was a regulatory taking. Well, it was both an exaction, outright taking in terms of the dedication piece, but a regulatory taking in terms of the limitations on development.
Yeah, I understand that part, but I'm talking about taking all of the floodplain, the A and the AE, and creating a special zoning district. And I guess a lot of cities do that. And that would not be a taking. That's my understanding. Now, that's different than a conservation easement, which is what then the city or whoever owned it would have control over it and could do stuff there. They could go plant trees or whatever they wanted to.
There's shades of gray. It depends on how far up your regulation goes as to how exacting it is and how much of an exaction it would be. If you were in Harris County, I could guarantee you whatever you did, we'd test it in the courts, and that would be what you would expect. Folks here seem to get to consensus a lot better than folks in Harris County do, and don't fight about it in the courts as much. So the point, though, is that you've engaged a public process of talking about the floodway as a whole, up and down, and everybody's engaged in that process.
Right, so the earlier statement that zoning does not constitute a taking applies as long as the zone is broadly, as long as it applies evenly across your area of jurisdiction.
Right, right.
Okay. And that it's an open public process.
Well, you
that-
can be distinct, you can have zones for specific reasons.
Right, like the historic overlay.
Right, right. But, there's gotta be something specific about that area that helps you define the zone that makes sense.
If you take a zone and rezone it, that could diminish the value of that property. You could be in a bind, possibly.
Yep.
There was a case out of California, Pacific Gas and Electric owned property along the ocean, along coastal property.
Yep.
And this is an old case, but
Yep.
on coastal property, the city of San Diego, or one of the cities along there, they had done nothing with it. They'd owned it for a long time, done nothing, said they were going to build a power plant, they never did. And so the city came in and turned it into a conservation district, made it a conservation district. PG&E sued them, saying you have diminished the value of our property by doing that, because now we can't sell it as industrial. And it also went all the way to the Supreme Court. And the courts at that point said to them, nobody guaranteed you a profit. You bought the land as a speculative thing. You didn't sell it when you could have. Too bad, so sad. You don't get the city can't guarantee you a profit on this land, because the city was going to pay them for the land, but not at the value of industrial property.
Well, yeah, that's a different argument. But yeah, you've impacted the development, the city's gonna pay for that. The question was, what is the development differential there? And then the question of, would you have gotten an industrial zone, because it probably wasn't an industrial zone or not, is a very important question. So that question then is, if you're bought the land, it's not zoned industrial, but you're thinking you're gonna upzone it to industrial so you can get the value of industrial land, you don't get that. Had they bought industrial land, then that would be a different question. So, yeah, you're not
Seems
guaranteed.
speculative.
Yeah, what's
Yeah, yeah, it's the speculative nature of the damages. Not that there were damages. Everybody understood there were damages. It's the speculative nature of the value of them. So you have to, that's what the trial process is about, is figuring out what that value is. Or what the public arena process is how do we recognize that value if it's something we're going to? So, yeah, onward.
All right. All right.
Oh, you said what you
Here you go. So next slide is, next section is factors to consider in making a land use decision. So one of the factors are secondary effects of a proposed use. So decisions on zoning applications should be made based on analysis of impact of the proposed use on the neighborhood and on the city as a whole. Such factors include traffic impacts, noise, light, air, crime, and facilitation of adequate provision of water, sewer, schools, parks, and other public requirements. And so when you guys review these zoning cases, there's criteria that you have to use whenever you're reviewing those, and those speak to these different elements, traffic, noise, light, to take into consideration the secondary effect of that land use on surrounding property. Reasonable use of the property. Again, any zoning regulation by a municipality must provide a property owner with a reasonable use of the property. And so always asking yourself when you're imposing conditions or asking for restrictions, does the proposed regulation allow the property owner a reasonable use of the property? And that term can be subjective again. And so I can let Steve Kirkland talk about it more, but essentially that's kind of the test that's used. And so if someone purchased a piece of property, anticipating to use it in a certain way based on current development regulations, and then something specific, thank you, Kirkland.
I was just getting comfortable there.
Sorry. There you go.
We kind of talked about reasonable in that last discussion, so it really is. Reasonable is in the eye of the beholder. If 5 of you see it as reasonable, then you probably got a good basis for that. The guy that's not wanting to do something that you're not letting is going to think you're all unreasonable. We end up fighting about that, whether they think it's enough to fight about in court or not, then it's an argument to a jury. So reasonable is in the eyes of the beholder, but it generally, if 5 of you find it there or 3 of you find it there, it's probably going to be found reasonable. So I wish I could tell you there was mathematical precision that's involved in this. There is not. And in none of these things is there mathematical precision. The point where you cross over the line between reasonable and unreasonable is not mathematically determined. How many of these different factors that you're looking at, that you're basing on, it's not a mathematical thing. You can't check off 3 and you win, or check off 4 and you win. It could be that number 7 is the one that really sinks it, or you could just check off 1 and that's enough. So none of it's math. And that case I was telling you about, the 2 exactions, the court says, we're not going to tell you math. It's the best we can come up with is reasonably proportionate. So, my profession gets paid.
Always.
And we're going to talk about proportionality in just a second, but these are the different challenges that can be made for zoning decisions. So it includes inverse condemnation, damaging or taking, which Steve just talked about, substantive and procedural due process, so making sure everyone has equal protection under that due process clause, in regards to our Open Meetings Act and other processes and procedures for approval of these types of requests. Failure to comply with statutory and local procedures, so failing to provide proper notice or public meeting venue accommodations, equal protection under the law, so making sure that similarly situated people are treated equally under that process. Free exercise, so again, free exercise to make your views known, attend public hearings, participate in the process. Spot zoning, which has come up a couple times in different various cases. Steve, do you want to?
So That free exercise is actually talking about the First Amendment's freedom
Oh.
of religion. So you can't make a decision based on, it's a Catholic church going in there and I don't want Catholics in my neighborhood. All right, or you can't let the neighbors make that argument to you and then give in to them. So free exercise is what that's about. I guess I should, a better example that would generally draw that kind of thing is if a Wiccan coven decides to set up a coven house. I mean, that would get people upset, probably. But you cannot allow that as the basis for why you would deny it. So if some similarly situated institution that drew the same amount of people and had the same impact on the streets, you would have to allow it. Spot zoning is where you've taken a spot and you've given them a zone. And they're different than everybody else around them. That just looks bad, for one. Doesn't look good on a map. And it looks like you as a body have done something special for that landowner. So
City of
you-
Nacogdoches was famous for that.
Thank you.
about 30 years ago. Fortunately, they've given that up, I think.
and that's, so spot zoning is frowned upon, and can be undone. So you don't want to do that. You want to make sure you've got those reasons for why you're doing something. And amongst those reasons is what are the surrounding uses? And are we getting compatibility there? So conditional zoning is where you make them put up a fence so that you're trying to harmonize the surrounding uses. But it can still be a spot zone too, so you gotta be cautious when you're doing conditional zoning. Don't recommend that you go down that path very often. The next one is really anathema, and it's contract zoning, which is, if you'll develop it this way, we'll give you a zone. Texas law is specific in saying conditional zoning is okay, contract zoning is not. Both of them are about trying to harmonize, if it's a good public policy making body, and most of them are, it's about trying to harmonize incompatible neighboring uses. The difference in terms of figuring it out is how much is involved in terms of the conditions that you're trying to get from them and the timing. So if the contract zoning is, if you do this, we'll change the zone, that's the contract where you're agreeing to do something in the future if they do certain things. That's illegal. There's a whole host of reasons for why that's illegal. Among them are the appearance of skullduggery. Because one of the things that you could have exacted from them is that they all put $25,000 in somebody's bank account. That's one of the reasons for it. The other thing is you're surrendering your police power to a contract, and that's also not allowed. Right? But simply put, you can get to both of those things if you're truly being a public body acting in the public interest, trying to harmonize conflicting uses. You can get to that with a PD, which is an open process. Okay.
Thank you, Steve. Don't go too far. All right, so now we're going to talk about proportionality. So Section 212-904 of the Local Government Code states that if cities require a developer to pay a portion of infrastructure cost as a condition of plat approval, such as street construction, water lines, sewer line, then the developer's portion of the cost must be roughly proportionate or consistent with only the impact of that proposed development. And so we'll give you some examples here in a minute, but typically those are costs that are estimated by a civil engineer because they're based on civil infrastructure, again, water, sewer, streets. So in this example, we have a 50-acre tract with this only proposed for one single family residence. And so a 15-foot right-of-way dedication and new 27-foot street construction may not be proportionate to that development because, yes, it's 50 acres, but it's one single family home. Whereas if it was the same tract, but they were proposing 100 single-family lots within a 15-foot right-of-way dedication in New Street would be proportionate to that development because that infrastructure cost allows them to essentially yield more lots, sell those lots, and have a higher return on their investment. And so when you're looking at proportionality, again, it's looking at what are we asking them to do as far as infrastructure or cost, and what are they building? Is that proportionate to the development? And so that's just an example of two properties, same acreage, but you have one lot versus 100. The first one, it's not appropriate to require all that for one home. It is appropriate and proportionate to require that for 100 lot subdivision. So any questions about proportionality or, okay, great, thank you. Questions and discussions. I know we went over a lot and we've got another workshop item. If you guys start thinking about this and you have questions that come up, feel free to reach out and direct those questions to myself or Steve Kirkland and we can get those answered, or we can just open it for questions right now.
Elena, that was very helpful, beneficial. Judge, thank you very much, sir.
Yes, thank you. It was good.
If there are no questions, we're going to take a couple-minute break real
Oh,
quick.
thank you.
Getting back to order.
All right, Chairman, so the next item is item 3B. I did want to offer to the commission, because I know it's getting late and we've been here for a while, we could postpone this workshop item to the September 26th meeting, if you would like, or we can continue to move forward. Some of the items that we talked about during that first workshop are things that will probably come up in the second one when we talk about floodplain ordinance and comprehensive plan and things like that. So I just wanted to offer that to the commission, but staff is here, we can move on and finish, or if it's the prerogative of the commission, we could postpone it to the next meeting.
Steve's waited all this time.
I know.
I think let's go ahead and knock it. If
All right.
commissioners are good with it, well, let's move forward.
All right.
Okay. Workshop, or work session 3B, presentation discussion regarding Chapter 4, Environment and Natural Resources of the 2003 Nacogdoches Comprehensive Plan and the City of Nacogdoches ordinances and regulations related to development in the FEMA-regulated floodplain.
All right, so during this presentation, we're going to talk about, again, some of the things that we covered in the first presentation about zoning and how that relates to the comprehensive plan, and then how that relates to our current development codes. And we use some examples. We did provide a couple of copies of some ordinances and material at your place. So one of those is Chapter 4 from the 2003 Comprehensive Plan. That's Environmental and Natural Resources Chapter, which we're going to reference. And the other one is Article 1, Chapter 42, under floods. This is from the Code of Ordinances. This is actually the ordinance that dictates how we regulate floodplain. And so this is online, but we wanted you guys to have a physical copy just for reference and to go through as we're going through the discussion. So just know those are at your place, and so I'll talk about them in just a minute. All right, so I won't go over this again. Brief history on zoning. These are the different chapters in local government code that give us that authority to regulate private development. Again, zoning is the division of tracts into different districts with different land uses. This is an image of the zoning map. So relationship to the comprehensive plan. So whenever we're looking at development codes and then the comprehensive plan, we have to understand, again, this is an important tool. So zoning, subdivision, sign code, even our flood ordinance, those are all tools to implement the comprehensive plan. Again, it provides legal basis for zoning and subdivision regulations and amendments, provides for avoidance of arbitrary and discriminatory regulations because of the consistency, and it coordinates land uses with other community development. Again, Chapter 213 of the Local Government Code, that's the comprehensive plan statute, and so provides for purposes, adoption by ordinance, conformity requirements, and then a zoning disclaimer essentially saying that a comprehensive plan shall not constitute zoning regulations or establish district boundaries. Essentially, it's a visual guide for how property should be developed. It's not a parcel by parcel specific mandate for zoning. I know oftentimes people get confused because the names are similar as far as the naming of the districts, and even the colors are a little similar. So it's important to make that distinction. Common elements of a comprehensive plan are land use, so the future land use plan, transportation plan, which looks at your corridors and your roadways, parks and recreation plan, which includes parks and trails, public facilities plans, which include fire stations, libraries, city hall, and other public facilities, and then environment and infrastructure. So infrastructure is water, sewer, drainage, things of that nature, and then written policies and goals. So again, the 2003, the comprehensive plan is meant to be a big visioning guide for cities and how they want to grow in the future. And then the zoning and subdivision regulations must be adopted in accordance with a comprehensive plan and designed to lessen congestion in the streets, secure safety for fire, panic, and other dangers, promote health and welfare, provide for adequate light and air, prevent for overcrowding of land, avoid undue concentration of population, and facilitate the adequate provision, transportation, water, sewer, schools, parks, and other public requirements. So this is right out of the local government code and essentially outlines the police powers that the commission and council has at their disposal to adopt regulations in conformance with those different criteria. All right, so again, zoning is a tool to implement the comprehensive plan. The comprehensive plan really looks at the interrelatedness of everything, so not just land use, but how that relationship affects infrastructure and community facilities and so on and so forth. And then you use zoning and subdivision to implement those priorities and goals. So when you're making a zoning decision, one of the things that you guys look at, and it's a criteria outlined in our staff reports, is compliance with the comprehensive plan. So the Nacogdoches Comprehensive Plan is very similar to others as far as the content. So it includes an environmental section, land use, transportation, utility infrastructure, housing, parks and recreation, and historic preservation. So historic preservation, those aren't things that you'll find in all comprehensive plans because not all cities are historic. But it is more common in communities like ours or that have a historic downtown. They'll have a whole chapter dedicated to just historic or cultural preservation. And so one of the examples that we're going to talk about is Chapter 4, Environment. And what I really want to talk about before we get into this is when you're looking at compliance with the comprehensive plan, there's all these different elements. So it's not just compliance with land use or transportation or utility infrastructure. We look at all those different elements and ask, what does the proposed change meet our planning goals, looking at kind of the big picture of what the goal is for that area, not just necessarily that specific parcel. So looking at kind of like a area or regional effect, ask ourselves, is this the best ultimate land use for this area rather than what the future land use plan designation is? Because sometimes we get it wrong. Or sometimes the future land use plan was appropriate when we adopted it, but due to development in the area or other changing conditions in the economy, maybe that land use is no longer appropriate because the market's changed, and so maybe time to change that based on proposals that come forward. Are there any environmental constraints? And does the proposed land use make sense for that location? So zoning is very nuanced, it's very gray. Like Steve said, there's no mathematical equation, which is why we have to have such wonderful, robust conversations about it, because I can pick up the zoning ordinance and interpret it one way, and Margaret can interpret it another way, and Lily can interpret it another way. And so a lot of this stuff is meant to provide for some leeway, for some interpretation, to provide flexibility, and make some common sense decisions, but then some of it is not. So it's just a very nuanced. But moving on. So the example that we're going to use is Chapter 4, which is the environment, because Steve's going to talk about the floodplain ordinance. So I thought it was appropriate to use this as an example. And if you look at your packet that we handed out, it identifies those key issues, starting on the first page. So it talks about protecting and conserving natural assets, managing creeks, bayous, and floodplain areas, protecting forested areas and critical species habitat, and preserving water quality. So that's kind of the four main pillars, and then the different goals stem from those. And so the goals of Chapter 4 include a conservation and protection of valued environmental resources in the Nacogdoches area. So those can include our creeks in natural areas. It also talks about development that is compatible with the natural environment, conservation and protection of valued environmental resources. Again, I think that's actually duplicated from that first item, so I apologize for that. That's a typo. And it looks like a couple of these others are, so I apologize. But essentially, it's all about preserving and protecting kind of our natural areas, making sure that their use will be provided for our future generations, and making sure that we're not doing anything to jeopardize that asset in the future. So these all kind of speak to that general goal. And it also includes excellent water quality in the Nacogdoches area. And so an example of one of those goals and then subsequent objectives and actions is the goal that development is compatible with the natural environment. So there's some specific objectives that are outlined under that goal, and we're just going to talk about a few of them. One of those is to guide future development patterns within the context of the physical environment and natural features of the community. So knowing that we don't do zoning in a box, we have to look at the property that's outside the boundaries of that parcel. So looking at the zoning and the land use of adjacent properties, looking at environmental assets that are in the area or located on that property that would impact future development. And another objective is using regulatory and development review procedures to ensure that land development in valued areas does not overwhelm the natural setting, cause significant environmental impacts, or result in sprawling development pattern. So that's where your zoning and your subdivision regulations come in. So that way, when we do apply environmental protections or preservation development standards, they apply to all properties that are similarly situated, and we're not doing it on an ad hoc parcel by parcel process. And then there's some specific actions that are recommended to meet those objectives. And so one of those includes encouraging compact development that emphasizes design with the natural environment, including preservation of trees and open space. So in some cities, you'll see what they call cluster development regulations, where maybe you have a 100-acre piece of property and 50 acres of it is encumbered by a large waterway or greenway. And so in order to allow that property owner to maintain the development rights based on the original size, you may allow them to build the same number of units, but concentrate it in a smaller area. So that would allow someone maybe to build smaller lots than what would normally be allowed in order to yield that same lot count. So essentially, they're not losing any development rights because of the encumbrance. We're providing an exception or accommodation to allow for that development with some flexibility to protect those natural resources. So that's an example of some areas that have a lot of creeks and floodplains that provide some accommodations and variations in their subdivision design to accommodate for protections of those natural resources. And yes,
Maybe this is premature. I know this, okay, so 2003, that's almost 20 years that
Yes,
this has
ma'am.
been around. And this is a great chapter. Like you said, it's aspirational. And I know Mr. Bartlett was instrumental in putting it together. And I think it's really good. I hope we don't stray too far from this in the next plan. But to your knowledge, have any actual ordinances been passed to implement any of this? Because I would like to know what they are, if there are any. And it's not on you. I know you haven't been here very long. but-
There's one amendment that I've taken forward since I've been here. It's a change to the zoning ordinance, and it spoke to screening and landscaping. So one of the changes that we took forward, because we were getting a lot of variance requests for it, so we're like, let's just incorporate it into our code. So if you have a commercial property that backs up to a residential property, it requires a 6-foot fence and a 10-foot landscape buffer. Well, some of these areas are separated by creeks or floodplain or like heavily vegetated areas. And so cutting all that down to build a fence and some plantings provides much less protection than if you would have left that area in its natural state. So we actually have an ordinance that we took forward about a year and a half ago, where someone can come to the Planning and Zoning Commission and request a alternative compliance for screening, essentially propose to just maintain a natural vegetated area in lieu of tearing it down and building the required fence without going through a variance process. So it's something that P&Z can approve to allow for the protection of existing environmental assets. So that's something that I've done since I've been here. I can let Steve speak to some other ordinances because he has more institutional knowledge than I do. So this time I think I'll just pass it on to Steve and let him try to answer
Great.
more detailed.
Evening, Steve Bartlett, your Director of Public Works and City Engineer. So I'll say certainly there have been some ordinances that touched on pieces of this, probably more so in individual actions and philosophy in some cases. So some of these items that you're asking about in Section 4 are not necessarily ordinance worthy. We don't have ordinance that takes floodplain land for parkland and things like that. But we have created ordinances that require tree protection. We have created ordinances that have landscape components. We have ordinances that are now erosion controls and things that would be in an MS4 regulated community even. So we've added a lot of those components to our whole portfolio of the way we treat development. And so it's kind of a half answer to your question, is which ordinances. I think it's been the modification to development ordinances, things like Elena just said, where we've tried to protect and preserve a little bit more of that culture and the trees and the greenery, so.
What about protecting priority conservation areas through conservation easement?
So we've had a tremendous amount of acreage gone into conservation easements. So where the old animal shelter was, all that's in a conservancy now. We just recently had a zoning case, where are you? There you are. With a property, Old Tyler Road area, where we had a section, y'all remember that were on commission, then into conservation easements. And that feeds into one of our tributaries of our floodplain system. And so we encourage that. We don't have a regulatory way to mandate it, but we've encouraged it even as recent as this year of having that happen.
So the area where the animal shelter used to be, I thought that was dedicated by an individual citizen and set aside. Does that belong to the city then?
No. It absolutely was. I'm saying the city participated in trying to encourage that with her and moving forward with that. You bet. So it isn't necessarily that it's all our ownership. And I will tell you one way, Ms. Forbes, that we do that. For example, we've acquired almost all the property from, as we say, from Baby Kroger north to the Loop. All that property is now preserved. We're doing native grass plantings, and of course there's trails planned to go in there. But part of this has been through purchasing. We've purchased lots that were in the floodplain on Meadowview and different streets. And these are through programs where we can get funds to do some of this too. So to me, we're reaching out, trying to do summer preservation through that. And part of it's been by purchasing land just to preserve it from development. What? You want me to start
That
mine?
actually concludes my portion, yeah.
You're supposed to say that.
Can I ask Elena another question on the Chapter 4 issue?
Yes.
I know that you've worked in other places, and I would just like to hear a little bit about how other communities handle the kinds of issues that are presented in Chapter 4, like watershed protection and floodplain protection and open space.
Yeah, so I will say that every community is different. They all kind of have the core meat and potatoes of zoning and subdivision regulations, but then several of them, the regulations vary widely from community to community. Some of that is based on kind of the existing conditions of the community as far as how much of the community is built out versus new construction. For older communities like Nacogdoches, where a large portion of the city was built prior to a lot of our development codes, it becomes more difficult. For a city like Frisco, where I used to work, half the city was built in the last 10 years. So it's very easy to adopt and enforce new regulations because there's so much greenfield left. And the real estate market there was very, very active. And so a lot of development happening, a lot of demand. And so the city was in a position to ask for more because the demand was so high. And so a lot of it depends on kind of your proximity to metro areas too, and your ability to kind of garner certain development and ask for restrictions. So that's a very nuanced conversation, but it also, again, depends on what you're trying to preserve, right? So what types of environmental resources do you have that you want to protect? That could be creeks, streams, rivers. It could be plains. You know, it doesn't necessarily have to be waterways. It just could be natural areas that are of, you know, cultural significance to the community. And those are usually acquired by parkland dedication or things like that. But for instance, when I worked in College Station, the floodplain ordinance was more restrictive than ours. So there was no construction allowed in the floodplain at all. So you could have some disturbance. You could do some grading if it was at grade, but there was no pavement, no buildings. Whereas our community, we allow for some limited development in the floodplain with some additional restrictions. I've worked in other communities where they had riparian buffers. So along the creek, there was actually kind of a setback from the creek bed where, you know, no development was allowed unless it was for recreational purposes. So you could have a trail, you could have some kind of public use, but it couldn't be for commercial business. So I think it just kind of depends on the community and the priorities, but typically I've never worked in a place that didn't have any floodplain protections at all, but it does vary widely from
So
community to
in
community.
your understanding of the Bryan College Station where they didn't allow any pavement in the floodplain, why do you think that they created that ordinance? And did you notice, or was there a belief that it somehow hampered development?
So I want to be careful because I wasn't there for the adoption of those ordinances, so I don't have a lot of that institutional knowledge. But College Station is a university town. They have one of the better-known civil engineering and planning degree programs. So that community is very aware of development regulations, best practices for development, and there's a lot of people in that community who are practitioners of that as well. And so the community is a little bit different as well as far as their expectations and what they expect and the priorities versus maybe a different community. And again, there's some floodplain, there's some creeks. I think a lot of it is just priorities and political will for some of that stuff. And so it's difficult for me to speak to that. And I think in some of those areas that are growing rapidly, they have a little bit more leverage to impose some of those conditions, especially when they have a lot of greenfield around those areas where they can have some consistency along those greenways. So for example, if you have a creek that's 50% built out and then the rest of it you're trying to provide a certain look or aesthetic, it's more difficult to garner support for that because there can be some disconnectedness or disjointedness along that corridor. So there's a lot of different reasons and rationales why one's community may regulate floodplain more heavily than others. I don't know if that actually answered your question.
Well, it sounds like you're saying that the more development there is, a little bit easier it is to protect these resources up front. And people will develop anyway because they're anxious to develop, so they just accept those conditions.
Yeah, a lot of it depends on the market. I'll tell you something that's unique to Nacogdoches is that most of our developers are local. So the people who are building in this community, you see them at church, you see them at the grocery store, they coach your kids' soccer team. Whereas some of these larger metro areas, it's a lot of capital investment from outside of the community. And so you have developers that's all they do, and they develop in larger cities. And so they have access to different capital. It's a different business model. Whereas a lot of our developers here, they're using personal capital. And so it's a different model. It's a different business model and different kind of character and market than what we have here. So we'll say that's kind of a nuance that you see because it's the nature of the people who are actually building in your community too. In College Station, it was kind of a mix. It's a lot of local. But then with the growth of the university, we were seeing a lot of insurgents from outside markets.
And what kind of riparian setbacks did they have in those two locations along streams?
So I'm thinking about the one in Frisco, and it was based on the slope and grade, so there was a calculation. I apologize, I can't remember offhand.
That's all right.
So.
And what about Bryan College Station?
They didn't have riparian buffers, but there were more restrictions in the actual floodplain and the type of grading that could take place in that area.
So I guess I would ask both of you, do you see us going in that direction? Do you think it would help our flooding risk and our situation to move towards a more restrictive floodplain ordinances? Because I know you and I have talked about it, and I told you I was going to put you on the spot.
Well, and I think there's different things that a community is trying to achieve with those regulations, right? So there's aesthetic regulations and kind of beautifying and celebrating, preserving that natural environment that could serve as economic development tool, that could serve as just community pride, beautifying the area. It can also function as a water quality tool, also function as a flood management tool. So these regulations can function different, purposes. And so I think, again, it just depends on the priorities of the community. But a lot of people use them for scenic preservation and beautifying the city because that's something that's a draw, that's a resource, that's an asset of the community. And others have real flood issues. So their regulations are just geared at preventing floods. And so I think it's a combination. I think that I haven't worked in a lot of cities, but of the ones that I have, our community has the most relaxed development regulations. And a lot of that is we haven't updated them in years. The zoning code hasn't seen a real major update since the 90s. And so as we're going through this comprehensive plan process, we're identifying areas that are in need of change and amendments, and we completely anticipate a complete overhaul of our development code after this comprehensive plan is updated, because we're going to have those conversations about, well, why haven't we done this? Well, this needs to be a priority. And so I expect that we'll see more recommendations on preservations of our natural areas, on limits, but again, that's going to be part of that public engagement process.
Absolutely, thank you.
All right.
Maggie, I'd like to say something really quickly too. Of course, this thing is from 2003 and there is no accountability for it going through. And so what we're discussing now and trying to enact more protection and preservation for these floodplains and for wildlife habitat and water usage for impervious zones and things like that for runoffs, this is a discussion that we can have going forward in the future so that we can make sure that we continue to keep beautifying Nacogdoches. So.
Absolutely, thank you.
I want to touch, before we start, on a couple points. Your first question. Let me give you a kind of a silly example, but if I lived on a lot that was 100 by 100, and the city decided to come up with regulations for 10-foot side lot setbacks that we didn't have before, my lot is so big that the impact would be really de minimis to me, and I would probably not fight that. If I lived on a lot, and again, I'm being facetious, that was 20 feet wide and very long, and a 10-foot setback on each side would have a great impact. And I think what you see, and I've worked in College Station, you guys know I was private practice for most of my career. They have a different geography, they have a different lot than we have here. We're built on a town that has a ridge down North Street and 2 creeks on each side, and we were literally have built around that. So you're gonna see in a minute, I'll show you that our model is different, and the reason that, I think part of the reasons we've reacted and not necessarily been in compliance with everything that's in this, and you're right, I co-authored this document, and so I'm very familiar with it, is because we have a lot of some physical constraints that make it a whole lot harder than College Station. College Station had a lot of development area, a lot of greenfield. We laugh, my middle daughter and grandkids live in College Station, and where they live used to be where I dove hunted. I mean, it's nothing like where College. So they have a lot of growth area, and we did not. And so I think part of that plays a role, and I'd like to show you some of that as we go through it. So I'm not supporting or arguing either way. I think I'm kind of, us engineers are pragmatists, right? And so I'm going to kind of show you some facts. But I'm going to, since it's so late, I'm going to move through the first part of this quickly. You stop me if that's okay. And I'm sorry, we just probably underestimated.
No,
So.
it's probably my fault.
So. All right, very quickly, I wanted to give you some background because I know some of you know a lot about it, some of you know very little. But just so you understand, FEMA was just kind of recently created in history. It's a 1979 created entity. Their mission was to mitigate all hazards. There's only 10 offices in the United States. We have one in Denton that covers 5 states, and they have very few employees there. So there's not FEMA police coming into town. And so because of that, as you'll see in a minute, they basically delegate that kind of control to local government entities. So you have a floodplain administrator at the city, which is myself, and you have one at the county, which is the county judge, and then I assist him on all the technical aspects, but don't tell him that. And no, but what I'm saying is delegate that authority to local governments. So prior to that, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, which was only started in '65, handled flooding. But guys, they did Trinity River Basin floods. They didn't do Mound Street floods, so they didn't work on a local basis. So Congress created the National Flood Insurance Program in '68. Again, that's before there was a FEMA. The Corps oversaw it. Because before 1950, flood insurance was part of your homeowner's policy. We had a couple of bad events. I don't know if they were hurricanes, I don't know. But all of a sudden, what does insurance companies do? They had to do a lot of payouts. They either raise your rates or they just exclude things. And so they began excluding flooding from policies. And so the government stepped in and basically said, we're going to create and underwrite flood insurance. And so part of this discussion is about flood insurance that motivates FEMA. It's really designed as a subsidized program, meaning what it costs you to pay for flood insurance, how albeit seems high, is not enough to actually for the payouts that they make. And this is a couple-year-old number, and I apologize, but they're $24 billion in debt, and I bet it's easily $30 billion today if we looked it up. Floodplain regulations and guidelines from FEMA are really based on reducing risk from flood damage. A lot of people confuse FEMA with other regulatory agencies, and these things exist in floodplains, threatened and endangered species, wetlands, facultative wetlands areas, things like that. Waters of the U.S. I wave my hands a lot, is not FEMA. So I understand as we read FEMA regulations, their motif is not to control that. Their motif is insurance. So, fun fact for the day, take this home. 100-year flood's kind of our metric for design. Engineers design bridges for a 100-year flood, but it is not a once every 100-year event. It is a 1% chance of happening in any given point in time. So that's kind of interesting. Everybody says, Steve, there's been 2 100-year floods this year. You're correct.
Hey, Steve, can I interrupt you just for 1 second? We will email you guys the PowerPoints after the meeting, so don't feel like you have to frantically take notes or anything. We'll provide the material so you guys can go back and reference it.
And I think it's only $9.99. I forgot. Yeah. Just under $10. We'll do it. So and that's not a map for you to look at other than to know that the federal government maps out rainfall events and creates what's a 24-hour, 100-year rainfall event. They give us this information. Just the only unique thing on this that I thought was interesting is a 100-year storm is 10.2 inches in a 24-hour period here. Okay, that's a made-up storm. But interestingly, a 50-year storm is not anywhere close to half. It's 9 inches in a 24-hour period. So if we have a 25-year storm, but it all occurs in 15 minutes, then we get a 1,000-year storm. So it's a very unique animal. I've always joked we've never actually had a 100-year storm according to their wonderful mathematical model. So we talked last time when I was here, and I waved my hands a lot without an exhibit. In fact, I told you I wish I had pictures to describe, but I wanted to talk real quick about floodway and floodplain, and sometimes we use those, or some people use those interchangeably, and I want to clarify that for you. These are actual real pictures. The one on the left is the softball fields, and the one on the right is just immediately turned right, and that is Lenana Creek. So to give you good vision, that's kind of the floodway look, and that's the way I describe it. More tongue-in-cheek than anything, but I say the flood fringe is the static area, the backed up water, the floodway is the flowing water. It's technically not truly what it is, but that gives you a vision of where those things are geographically located. So if you look real quick, the floodway is the floodplain is the whole thing. It's everything that floods. The flood fringes are areas that we're going to show you in a minute are developed, and the floodway is actually a computer-generated theoretical line. So it's not actually the creek bank or the area where the logs are floating real fast, but that's the vision I give the public when we talk. So very quick, not to get technical with it, but the floodway is basically where we encroach. You see the 2 brown encroachments there? We are filling the floodplain area in that fringe to a point, fill, and when you squeeze it, the water has to rise. Same amount of water goes through. If you give it a smaller conduit, it gets deeper. And so as we fill the floodplain with development, then the water surface rises and we can cause flooding upstream and downstream, both actually. And so the floodway is determined in a computer model as how much can you fill the floodplain to what point that gives a 1-foot rise, because beyond that is no-go. So they really generate that information to give us guidance as floodplain administrators on how far we can allow fill.
This is on a specific piece of property. This is the analysis you would do on a specific piece of property if someone wanted to place fill.
So it is completely already done for us in the whole city. So I'll show you that. And so I'll show you how they do it. The floodway lines are determined throughout the entire city already.
Right, I understand
Yes.
that, but if someone wants to place fill in the floodplain and therefore reduce its capacity, its volume available to carry the flood,
Right.
then you have to do some computations to determine if it's going to increase the flood elevation, the base flood elevation 1 foot.
No, ma'am. If
No,
they
that's not
fill
right.
in the floodplain up to this theoretical floodway line,
Okay.
then it will not impact it more than 1 foot according to the model. So we don't
Okay,
do,
so you have that line somewhere.
that
in
line
there.
is, yes, we do. And again, it's theoretical, it's not done by elevation. So basically what's allowed in floodway, or we call them floodway encroachments. Development is basically prohibited unless there's an analysis that shows there's no increase in flooding. You say, how can that be? Well, if you own 1,000 acres and you want to do a little bit in the middle of a creek, then you can show that by the limits of my property, the water surfaces are back down to where they were, then there's no impact of flooding on adjoining properties, then you can do encroachments in the floodway. But you have to model and show that. Well, it's obviously a very, very rare circumstance that somebody has a little development, big acreage, and can show that. So generally speaking, there's no development, and that constitutes no fill or increase in ground elevations. FEMA allows and specifically delineates paving or driveways at grade, basically at existing ground levels, small obstructions like mailboxes, power poles, sewer manholes, and light-duty fences, which kind of surprised me when I read all this. Fences have to be able to lay over in a flood. So how do we know where they are? Well, starting in 1981, which is one of your questions, I believe, our first maps came out. This was from studies that was done in the late 70s and finally compiled into mapping for us. We paid for what they call a detailed study, which gives me some numbers out of that, very detailed flood elevation numbers in a separate book. And this defines floodplain and floodway lines overlaid on a local street map. So now I can look at your property and see where the floodplain is. Our current maps were revised. They came out in 81. They were revised in 2010. Unfortunately, they didn't redo the analysis. They didn't redraw the floodplain, rerun the models. They just updated the background map. If you pull the 1981 flood map out, there is no University Drive north of Austin because it didn't exist when they did that map. So they've updated their maps. I will also tell you as a surveyor, if you measure distances and you're trying to help people determine floodplains, if you measure from Main Street up to Austin Street, if you survey that, the distance you get on the ground does not match the map. So the maps were not stretched right and sometimes gave us difficulties in locating floodplains. So the flood insurance rate map, we won't go into detail. This is what it looks like. It's kind of an engineer's dream map, but the gray area is the floodplain. The little hatched area is the floodway line. And then all the little alphabets in there are cross sections we can look at in that detailed study. And the squiggly lines are elevations that we can see the base flood elevation. So all that information is contained in those maps. We make it a lot easier, and this is publicly available to you and citizens on our interactive webpage or GIS website. We take the floodway and the floodplain. The light blue area is the floodway, the kind of blue hatched area is the floodplain, and the red hatch is the 500-year floodplain, which Harris County or Houston is now actually adopted as their new building floodplain line after Harvey. So, but we have all this where you can put a 2021 photo behind it, look at your house and go, oh my goodness. So it's kind of a neat tool. So some interesting facts, and this is kind of where I was headed with our discussions a while ago, Commissioner Forbes, is we have 1,140 tracks in the city, and that's what they're colored that. I said pink, and somebody corrected me to salmon colored. 1,140 tracks that are in or partially in the floodplain. Part of the track or all of the track is in it. It constitutes about over almost 4,500 acres. But interestingly, there are just over 100 flood policies totaling $13 million in value, and that may have changed since I dug this up a little. Uniquely, what I'm saying is there's a whole lot of tracks in the floodplain, and very few of them have flood policies, which we just thought was a unique thing to put on here. But you can see where they all are correlated, and all those that are highlighted have some portion, if not all, in the floodplain. Another fun fact is really the only reason I put this in here. So before 1981, we had 332 buildings that were in the floodplain. That's the purple dots. So I get asked a lot, now, Steve, why did the Del Oro apartments flood? Didn't you guys know better? Why'd you let them build there? They were built before the flood map came out. So they were one of the purple dots. We didn't have a map to guide us. Probably could have used some smarts and said, every time I come out here, it's underwater, but that didn't happen, and so they were built. So we do, after 81, we did not allow development where they would have the potential for flood. Why? Because they have flood insurance, and we try to protect the integrity of the flood insurance. Just interestingly, another 144 structures were built in the next 39, I think it's gone up now from that, years, which are green dots, but 52 have been removed. We have paid for some of those structures to be removed, and some were removed just because they fell apart or deteriorated, and we would not allow them to rebuild. So you ask, what are we doing? Part of it is to avoid rebuilding or improving those structures that currently are in the floodplain. So, and this is gonna go to the point that we were making a while ago, but I wanted to introduce you to how do you change the map? Well, there's two conditions. One is you might say, I'm in the floodplain according to your map. I actually had a property that showed to be in the floodplain in a building, but when we surveyed it, it was not. So the maps are very coarse, I will just tell you. In 1970s, the way they surveyed them, the way they modeled them, was a much more coarse method, and therefore they're not highly accurate. They're the Bible, but they're not necessarily accurate. So if you can prove that your property is out and was naturally out, then you do this letter of map amendment. They don't want to redraw the maps. So they do it by a letter, make it publicly findable, and put it in the record. If you go in and add fill, which is what we'll talk about, then you can do a letter of map revision for fill, where you add earth and fill, you remove property from the floodplain, you get a letter or approval from FEMA saying we recognize this as no longer being in the floodplain. So that is how we do, and I know you had an exhibit that showed some areas of development. One of them was this area, Lumberjack Lofts, these apartments. So let me walk you through, because this is kind of important. The light blue lines are where the floodway is off that map. The blue hatch is the floodplain, the red hatch is the 500-year floodplain, and you can ignore it. I just can't turn it off in my system. So what the owner of this property did is they went in that yellow area and filled it. Now, you see, up to the floodway line, they filled it and brought the elevation of the ground above the flood elevation, which we provide that elevation for them. And then they went to FEMA and said, we like a letter of map revision from Phil. FEMA removed it from the floodplain. So what I'm telling you now, that blue hatch area now swings over and coincides with the floodway for that duration and swings back. So when they built these apartments, they did not build them in the floodplain, and I understand that's a technicality when I say it that way, but they filled it, removed it, got permission, and then built them. So they are not in the floodplain according to insurance and technical requirements. You have a question?
I might be jumping the gun, but how do you calculate the impact that and all of these developments along the creeks have on downstream flooding and the rise in elevation of a flood event?
So I will say we don't actually calculate. The premise is that if we stay within that floodway line, and this is Nacogdoches, not College Station, or Denton, or wherever, if we stay with fill outside that floodway line, then we have accepted the fact that those impacts will be a foot or less. In this case, it'll be less because the other side of the creek isn't developed or filled right now. So we assume and accept that 1 foot rise in impact. So uniquely enough, as you'll see in a minute, all our ordinance requires that all buildings be built at least 1 foot above the floodplain. So does that make sense? We've got a potential 1 foot rise. We make them build at least 1 foot above your finished floor elevation and mechanical equipment as well. That's not a coincidence that those are the same number. Some cities use 2 feet just to make for extra margin, and that's probably a wise decision we can talk about in the future. But I wanted you to understand this distinction. They filled it, got permission to remove it from the floodplain. It's now no longer floodplain, and they built the project. Again, this is touching on insurance, folks, and you understand that. This is not, is there ecosystem change? Is there impacts to threatened and endangered species or whatever? And by the way, I will tell you, to do a LOMR, that letter of map revision, they have to also certify that there's no environmental impacts to threatened and endangered species. It's an interesting rider on the form. So FEMA doesn't have the resources to monitor all this. Like I told you earlier, they adopt floodplain managers. We review permit construction within flood zones according to whatever our local ordinances are, but never below what FEMA dictates as an ordinance. Our ordinance that we'll take a peek at and that Elena talked about is in fact a mimic or an exact copy of a model ordinance that FEMA gives us. So here's what FEMA says. If you guys want flood insurance for your residents, if you want to help to protect them, then you must adopt an ordinance that protects the floodplain, limits development, limits height of development, but all those are about risk. In other words, make it high enough that it doesn't flood if you do what we just saw at Lumberjack Lofts, which is now adjacent to a floodplain. So Chapter 42 we added in 77 and later revised it in 2010 is based, again, as I said, on a model ordinance by FEMA. That's an area there, I think Old Tyler Road area, where we had a bad flood. So you can see why we do it. We won't go through the ordinance in detail, but I thought the statement of purpose was interesting. It goes everything from human life and health safety aspects to minimize business interruptions, but to help maintain a stable tax base by providing for the sound use and development of flood-prone areas. So whether we agree or not, I'm not talking about philosophy here, I'm saying our current ordinance dictates that this is their premise. So it is a purpose there to provide for the good and proper use of floodplain areas.
So I just wanted to point out, earlier we talked about there's different purposes for floodplain ordinances. Some are strictly for floodplain mitigation, some are for scenic, natural view preservation. So there can be multiple functions of these regulations. You may have the same regulation, but serve different functions. And so just wanted to provide an example. In that language, you didn't see language that talked about preservation of natural views or scenic or things like that.
It's not a comment of right or wrong, it's a comment of the author and the city at the time, their view of what they wanted to do. So I wanted to give you some perspective. The picture's just meant to be a picture, but as I look, if we looked up and down, what do we have in the floodplain that it's been filled? After 81, they have all been filled out and permitted out. But even before that, of course, we built things, but I grouped them by color to help you, but you can see University Drive north of MLK would not have been built if we had that in place. And there's about 70 buildings or structures just along that corridor. NIBCO, Texas Farm Products, Clear Springs, Kingham Construction, all those buildings, Lone Star Feed, were built in or around, and some of them are floodable in the floodplain. Kingham Construction's building has a building that can be flooded. So SFA's Gardens, the Coliseum, and SFA's Main, I think it's the commuter parking lot, is that what it's called, across from the Coliseum, is completely in there. And so some of those things would not be built if we had a different approach to this. Not saying good or bad, I just want you to understand those wouldn't be there. Pecan Park, Bonita Creek Park, our dog park, Festival Park, our softball fields, our soccer fields, none of those could have been developed if we had a development moratorium on floodplain. So we could have modified moratoriums that allow for recreational use or allow of only certain tree cutting, and I understand all that. I want you to know that if we have a no-touch rule, no-touch philosophy, those things wouldn't exist, and we'd have to have rules that would allow some uses if you wanted to see some of these. Public facilities, city garage, city hall parking lot, the county's annex and adult probation, the railroad depot, the farmer's market, and all those developments have been for some time in many cases in a floodplain area. Some of them still reside below the flood elevation. We have a lot of residents, y'all, on Church Street, Pecan, Fredonia, Mound, Ruby, and even some on Pearl that are well below flood elevations today. Most of them are older residences. Not good. I'm not telling you it's good. I'm telling you they exist. So I want you to understand that it's a huge, that almost 1,140 tracks has a lot of development on it. The core of our city, our University Drive, would virtually not be developed. So the question is, as we begin to think about how we can change our ordinance and change our comp plan recommendations in the future, we've got to balance the economics. I don't know what the tax rate would be if we didn't have the assessed value of all these things. I'm not going to propose to know. Pam would yell at me, but it's significant. And so we've got to figure out how to blend these two in a community where we are built along the creeks. We are built along the creeks. So I get asked a lot, so Steve, we'd like to do riparian zones or BMP zones, some people call it best management practice zones along the creek. And they could be the entire floodplain, they could be the floodway, they could be a given distance off the creek bank. And I will tell you, we took a snapshot picture, and you can get different snapshots and different ratios, but I wanted you to understand one point. And I know this is a very confusing map, but this is part of Nacogdoches. The pink area, or salmon area, and the green area together are a drainage area. So that whole area drains to the creek, which is on the right-hand side there. And if we limited no development in the floodplain, there's not a whole lot of development in the floodplain, which is behind that kind of green color, but it would filter natural vegetation left unobstructed would filter that green area. So anything that happened in that green area would get natural filtration as the runoff went to the creek. The pink area and all those little purple lines and stuff is our storm drain system. That is urban development, pavement, parking lots, streets, buildings. It's all picked up in storm drains and like a little Schlitterbahn goes to the creek. So if you and I park in the parking lot or drive down North Street and drip a drop of oil, it rains, it doesn't get filtered by the green area. It gets below the green area, and we poke it out in the creek in multiple outfall points. So does the green area do any good? Sure it does. So I'm not saying it is. What I wanted to show you, here's just a snapshot picture where 80% of the area bypasses the filtered area. 20% of it gets filtered. It filters only about 5% of the total flow. So about 95% of the total urban flow goes through storm conduits. So we are not what they call an MS4 community. MS4 is a conduit. We don't meet the population requirements to basically have regulations on our storm drain outfalls. That's a whole nother lecture and discussion. So we basically, the drop of oil in the parking lot makes it to the creek. The herbicide that we spray along the curb and the bug spray we put around the building all can wash off, and in most cases are not being filtered through those riparian buffers. They're, like I say, they're a Schlitterbahn to the creek. So if we're gonna talk about saving water quality, and I think everybody's on board with that, nobody would vote with a thumbs down to that, I think we have to explore how's the best way to do that so that we don't destroy our economic development potential, only realizing that a significant part of our already developed city, is conduiting these things in there. So we need to talk about different methodologies. So real quick, and guess what? I'm at the end. So I'm trying, you know that.
You're doing great. You're doing great, Steve.
Speed talking.
I am. I wave my hands a lot. So I learned how to speed talk from somebody behind me. But our city flood ordinance, really coupled with our daily permitting, we inspect, we follow statutory requirements even at the federal level, is how we do our management. See, all your city engineering staff are trained in flood hydraulics, and our technical staff, no, we're not professional engineers, are certified floodplain managers. So we make sure our people are educated in how to handle permits in new development. Flood damage, quite honestly, and the question you asked early on, is rare. We rarely see flood damage here now. And so I take that to two things. One is we don't allow people to build where they're going to get flood damage. And second, they're above a lot of that flood damage area. Yes, we still have Rio del Oro apartment problems. But by and large, when we have our big floods here, we do not have significant dollar damages.
They still rent out that building that's down the lowest building?
Yes.
Do they still rent apartments?
Yes, they do.
We used to have
And we
flood
send
parties
PD
down
out,
there
yeah.
back when we were
Yep.
in college.
We send PD out there and we evacuate them when it gets that high. We monitor these creeks as they come up.
Did
But
you say flood
I want you to
parties?
know that a motivation of
Don't miss
reducing flood damage to structures and property is really de minimis for us in most cases. So our maintenance on the creeks is as diligent as it can be. One thing people are very shocked about in Harris County, where Judge talked about, Harris County Flood Control has the oversight of virtually all their main drainage ways. They either own them in fee or they have significant easements encumbering properties. They maintain it, they manage it, and they regulate it. Here, almost every single ounce of Lanana, Bonita Creek, and all the tributaries are privately owned. So I can't come in and manage them, correct them. Engineers, we'd make a trapezoidal pavement channel in it or something cool like that. I'm not allowed
And
to.
film movies in it.
I know. So I'm just saying they're all privately owned. So whether I get a call, says there's a tree falls across the Lanana Creek, Steve, y'all need to come get it. I go, it's your backyard. I can't use tax dollars to clear it. But it obstructs flow and it has problems. And so we work through those problems, y'all. But I'm telling you, I want you to know that we don't own it. We don't own it. Even the big area I told you north of Baby Kroger, as we said, parts of that we don't go to the creek on. Parts of that we're by the owner on the other side of the creek. So anyway, I know we got questions, and I have to throw in your grandkids.
Somebody else asked.
Yeah, you have to throw in your grandkid pictures every now and then, so I did that. But
He did so well. I don't have any questions.
Somebody else asked a question.
Thanks to both Steves tonight.
Yes.
thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, very informative.
I concur, thank you.
And Elena, yes, always to
Elena.
Elena.
Very,
Juan,
very
for being
informative.
the champion supporter right there.
So Chairman, can I make one suggestion for thought?
Yes, sir.
So I know that we are in a different culture than we were when we wrote this comp plan. We have different interest level. We have different regulatory groups interested in some forms of management. I want you to be educated in what management makes a difference versus what doesn't. I want you to also be educated in that there are going to be some economic impacts to those decisions that are made. So consider that one of the almost gimme areas is the floodway. So the floodway, I don't let them develop in it, and to keep those as some form of buffered vegetated zone, maybe except for trails or something, it is a reasonable approach to get there. I mean, because right now, other than FEMA's rules, we don't stop. So I'll give you one example, and then I will shut up. But Splash Kingdom, and we take a lot of heat over that, but their rear parking lot is in the floodway. And it does flood. You've seen it flood. And it floods on a 10-year storm. And it was built at grade. It was built at grade, and it floods. They knew it. They accepted it. Maybe we don't want to do that practice, is my point. At the time, we didn't have an ordinance to stop them as long as they met this FEMA requirement. So I'm just saying, as we look at, are we going to shut down University Drive and not allow somebody to add onto their building or repair it? Or are we going to come up with some reasonable buffer? I just wanted to plant that for thought, that the floodway is at least an easy intermediate point. And I'm sorry. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve, so much.
Thank you. Can I made these handouts. Can I distribute? I know it's late. I promise I won't talk about them very long. I promise. I guess I have a hard time with a couple of things. One is that there wouldn't be any development. There wouldn't have been any development if it hadn't been in the floodway or in the floodplain, because, I mean, obviously, things would have developed. They didn't have to be in the floodplain. The soccer fields, now I'll make a huge exception for the soccer fields. Soccer fields, baseball parks, yeah, those things belong in the floodplain because the water can infiltrate, there's no risk of property damage and so on. But I think that there still could have been a University Drive. It just might have not have been right where it was. And the other thing is and I don't understand the floodplain regulations as well as you do, so I may have a wrong impression. But I have done a lot of natural stream channel design, which for the Corps of Engineers, which requires that you calculate the floodplain, and the streams have to be connected to the floodplain because that's part of their critical function. They don't function correctly if they're disconnected from the floodplain. But it sounded like you might have been saying that we could fill all the floodplain on both sides of the creek and not raise the water level all up and down the stream and not raise the water level more than 1 foot. And that defies logic to me. And you may be correct. I'll have to dig a little bit more into it. But there are so many developments, already downstream of this on Lanana Creek, Bonita Creek Hall, the Legends, Del Oro, and I just don't see how placing fill in the floodplain is not going to impact what happens to those properties.
Elena, quick question for clarity here. We need to make this record, and we probably should not be debating or talking about this. Is this a future agenda item, or is this in
Well-
conjunction with a work session?
Yeah,
It's the
that's
floodplain.
fine, because we have people that come to public hearings and present the commission with all sorts of evidence, as long as,
already
Margaret
have-
gave me a copy
Okay,
already.
okay.
So we do have a copy that we'll put in the case file, so we've taken care of it on that end, so it's,
And the other point I wanted to make, just really briefly, I know we're all tired, is that, there's 2 pages there, is that, things are changing from a climatic point of view, and a warmer atmosphere means more intense rainfalls. I have a project site in Corsicana where I was watching the news and I saw a train washed off the track. It was 1,000 feet from my project area. Who sees a train washed off the track? Houston has had 3 500-year flood events in a 3-year period. Dallas, Austin. The 100-year floodplain boundary is an estimate, like you pointed out, and we should expect it to be moving upland, not towards the creek, which requires us to take an even greater caution for placing fill in the floodplain and potentially risking whatever goes there as well as whoever's downstream. So I just wanted to share that.
Thank you, Meg.
Can I jump in right quick? All of those are great points for changing the regulatory environment that we operate in. They're great points for adopting a new ordinance and pushing for more intense restrictions. Putting together a resiliency plan is what a lot of communities are doing to deal with climate change and address those issues and try to grab the engineers' knowledge and try to use that to project what you would be doing to respond to these climatic events. You don't have that right now. You've got this ordinance that was adopted back in the 80s that was built on whatever they were doing then and is focused on the insurance, not the other values that are very important. And that is something that we should be talking about in the comprehensive plan development so that when you get it done, you have a consensus of what this community wants to see. And then we can write it for you.
Promise? No, I'm just kidding. We'll let Steve write it. The other Steve.
The Steves will write it.
Anything else from Lana?
Not on this item. I think we can move to item 7 and 8.
Yeah, we didn't do open forum, so is there anyone who has an open forum? Nope.
No.
Okay, we'll move on to city council decisions on planning and zoning.
All right, thank you. So, yes, City Council on September 6th heard the request to amend the development plan for the Creek Bend subdivision, and that was approved unanimously, so that's the only update. And the item number 8 is discussion and possible action on future agenda items. This is where the Planning and Zoning Commission can inquire about a subject for which we haven't provided notice. A statement of a specific factual information or recitation of a policy may be given, but if you guys want to deliberate on an item, we need to place that on a future agenda.
Does any of the commissioners have anything to place on?
Yeah, I'd just like to do a proposal or that we, before when we did one time a month for our meetings, it was great, except that we started getting busier and busier and then we added workshop items. It doesn't seem like the flow of the items that are coming to us in the city, and that's based on your volume and what you think that would be. Has it been as busy? Has it slowed down? Do you think there's gonna be seasons? Because I'm proposing that we do a one-time a meeting, back to a one-time a meeting instead of a two-time. Shannon's really busy as
Okay.
doing all his business, and I don't know if this is gonna interfere or whatnot, but I'd like to
Yeah.
open that up for discussion for us.
Yeah, we will place that on a future
Okay.
agenda item.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anything else? Well, I want to thank everyone for their time tonight, and if there's nothing else,
Thank you for taking your evening off to
Judge.
educate
Thank y'all.
us.
Steve,
Thank
Lana,
y'all.
thank you so much, and
Thank you.
Juan, thank you so much. and
We're
Juan's
lucky to
already
have
left.
both of y'all, all of y'all,
Yeah,
city
Juan.
people. You guys definitely do with a lot.
Rhonda.
She had to